Chapter 922. Summoning the wind with a brush, gathering clouds with a wave of his sleeves, and splashing ink with a handful of dark clouds in the sky, the master of calligrapher's talisman Taoism's state and skills in this battle were far beyond the imagination of ordinary cultivators. Even Ning Ke could not help but admire him. He was indeed the most powerful figure in the world. For Sang Sang, this was still not enough to impress her. She only felt that the way the man gathered the clouds was somewhat pleasing, mainly because she liked it and thought that the clouds were a little dirty. Seeing Sang Sang's tall figure, the master of calligrapher was shocked and his face became extremely pale. Then tears flowed down and diluted the blood spots on his front robe. He was a visiting professor of the West Hill Divine Palace and also a believer of Haotian. After knowing that Haotian came to the human world, his mind and spirit were all in it. Who would have thought that Haotian would suddenly appear in front of him? Why could Ning Ke escape from Peach Mountain and why could he ignore the big splashing ink? At this moment he had the answer. He even understood some more things. He stood on the opposite side of Haotian. How could he not be defeated? Defeat was the only way. His mind was shaken again and again, and his snow mountain and ocean of chi were unstable. He spat out blood again. Sang Sang stood in front of him and ignored the changes in his mind. She looked at the sky full of dark clouds with her hands behind her back. As she looked down, the crack that Ning Ke had cut in the clouds suddenly expanded and spread to the surroundings. In a moment, it disappeared without a trace and the blue sky was revealed. The dark clouds dispersed and the sky fell again. The Great River Kingdom's imperial palace became bright again. The people who were previously blocked from seeing the scene of the master of calligrapher sitting in a pool of blood could not help but exclaim. Sang Sang walked into the main hall, and the tall and thick door of the hall opened without any wind. The big black horse came from the middle of the square. Ning Ke sheathed the iron cutlass and tied it to the side of the saddle. Then he followed her into the hall. The hundreds of bodyguards in the main hall were undoubtedly the bravest men of the Great River Kingdom. However, no one dared to stop Sang Sang when she walked into the hall. The bodyguards did not know who this woman in indigo was. But they remembered the magical scene at the main gate of the imperial palace and knew that even the master of calligrapher was not her opponent. Sang Sang walked in the quiet palace without making any sound. Countless bodyguards and eunuchs protected the Great River Kingdom's emperor behind them and retreated with pale faces. The scene looked a little strange. There was a square platform in the deepest part of the palace, on which there was a beautiful and luxurious throne. It was the throne of the Great River Kingdom's emperor. She stepped on the carpet of the floor and casually sat on it. It was difficult for her to be interested in the affairs of the human world. But because today's event was related to Ning Ke, she walked into the palace. She had no interest in the throne of the Great River Kingdom. The reason why she was sitting on the throne was simple. It was the highest and most central seat in the hall. As Haotian, it was only right for her to sit on it. However, it was not that for of the princess. They did not know what. They did not know their minds. They only. And of the throne of the people of. Of this was treason, the greatest insult to the Great River Kingdom's ruler and people. It was something that could not be forgiven. However, the faces of the people in the palace were pale, and they still did not dare to do anything. They seemed to be in great pain. Ning Ke led the big black horse to the bottom of the carriage. He looked up at her and asked, "Why are you sitting there?" Sang Sang waved her sleeves. Flowers bloomed in the carriage. She said calmly, "I like it." Ning Ke was helpless. He looked at the crowd and asked, "May I ask who is the monarch?" The king of the Great River Kingdom was after all. He separated the eunuchs and bodyguards in front of him. He looked at Ning Ke and said, "Mr. 13, what are you trying to do by breaking into the palace?" Ning Ke looked at the monarch and said, "Monarch, you worry too much. I just have something to ask of you." The king of the Great River Kingdom looked at him like a wild cat playing with a mouse. He smiled sadly and said, "Are you going to kill me regardless of the friendship between the two countries?" Ning Ke shook his head and said, "Monarch, you worry too much." The king of the Great River Kingdom looked pale. He looked at the woman in the carriage and said sadly, "You even took my throne. Do you want me to pretend that nothing happened?" Sang Sang felt that Ning Ke was extremely hypocritical. They had already beaten and bullied each other in the palace, but now he was too embarrassed to speak. She had seen all the flowers and trees in the palace and found what she wanted. She did not want to waste any more time. She looked at the monarch and said, "Cancel the engagement." The monarch and the people of the Great River Kingdom were not surprised by this answer. Ning Ke broke into the palace and hurt people despite the friendship between the Tang Empire and the Great River Kingdom for generations. But they did not understand who the woman in the carriage was and why she helped Ning Ke to do this. It seemed that her words were more effective than Ning Ke's. In the face of an unimaginable gap in strength, courage did not make much sense. However, canceling an engagement was one of the two most humiliating things for a man. Ning Ke could endure one, but it did not mean that other men could endure the other like him. Moreover, that man was the monarch of a country. The king of the Great River Kingdom said, "If I cancel the engagement, how can I win the trust of the people of the Great River Kingdom?" Sang Sang felt that this problem was very simple. Humans often thought of problems too complicated. She was a little impatient and said, "Since the engagement says that she will marry the monarch, you can just refuse." The monarch of the Great River Kingdom was stunned. He thought that the monarch was not an official position. How could he refuse? Sang Sang looked at him and said, "Die or abdicate. You choose one of the two ways." For the monarch, there was no difference between death and abdication. Naturally, he could not accept it. His face suddenly became abnormally pale, but his eyes began to show a resolute expression. If they could not change the ending no matter how they resisted, some people might choose not to resist and silently accept it. But the Tangs and the people of the Great River Kingdom would think that since that was the case, why not resist? With the change of the monarch's expression, the guards in the palace gradually became silent. They held the hilts of their swords and began to prepare for the final death by fighting. At this moment, there was a hurried sound of horse hooves outside the palace, followed by a flurry of shouting. A dusty soldier rode straight to the front of the palace and fell to the ground, unable to get up again. The cavalry of the West Hill Divine Palace is marching south. The vanguard has crossed the Great River and entered Guanbei Commandery. There was a sudden dead silence in the palace. The courage and fighting spirit that the monarch of the Great River Kingdom and the guards had just gained suddenly disappeared. This was because the cavalry of the West Hill Divine Palace had arrived. The Great River Kingdom and the Tang Empire had been on good terms for generations. Naturally, they could not be too close to the West Hill Divine Palace. Moreover, they had a deep hatred with the Yueluan Kingdom of the South Jin Kingdom. The reason why they could live in peace over the years was that they had been very respectful to the West Hill Divine Palace. The most important reason was of course the prestige of the Tang Empire. The cavalry of the West Hill Divine Palace had already passed the Great River Kingdom? What did they want to do? What did they want to do? For the Great River Kingdom, the West Hill Divine Palace was definitely not a power that they could fight against. In the past, the Divine Hall would still respect or fear the Master of Calligrapher. But now that the Master of Calligrapher was severely injured and could not fight again, who would fight against the cavalry? If it was in the past, the Great River Kingdom would still have a way out. They would definitely ask for help from the Tang Empire at the first instance, hoping that the power of the Tang Empire could scare away the invading enemies. This was definitely not going to work now. People thought as they looked at the young man holding the big black horse in the palace. "Your Majesty, please abdicate." The Master of Calligrapher walked in from outside the palace. His footsteps were exceptionally heavy. His face was paler than his loose hair, and his expression was even more confused and frightened. The king of the Great River Kingdom was furious and looked at him in confusion. He thought that even if he was going to die, how could he surrender to the enemy? The Master of Calligrapher coughed painfully and did not dare to look at the woman on the imperial chariot. He said sadly, "If your Majesty does not want the Great River Kingdom to disappear, you'd better listen to the distinguished guest's opinion." Hao Yin had left the Divine Kingdom and came to the human world as a guest. Naturally, he was a distinguished guest. The king of the Great River Kingdom looked at the Master of Calligrapher and understood many things. Then he suddenly lost all his strength. The Master of Calligrapher walked to the imperial chariot and knelt down. He said, "Please tell me." Sang Sang said, "If you abdicate, the engagement will naturally be cancelled. Why do you need to ask me?" The Master of Calligrapher said in a trembling voice, "Who will take over the throne?" Sang Sang was silent for a moment and realized that this was indeed a problem. She looked at the crowd in the palace and found only one familiar person. Just him? Ning Ke was shocked. He pointed at his own nose and said, "You want me to be the emperor of the Great River Kingdom?" The Master of Calligraphy was also shocked. He raised his head and said, "He is a Tang?" Sang Sang said, "The Tangs and the Great River people are just human beings in my eyes." The Master of Calligraphy dared not say another word. The people in the hall were shocked speechless. Sang Sang left the imperial carriage and walked out of the hall. The Master of Calligraphy, who was seriously injured, bowed and followed behind to see them off. Walking out of the hall, Sang Sang stopped and looked back at him saying, "I was interested in you because you dared to call yourself a sage. I thought there must be something different about you, but you disappointed me. The master of calligraphy didn't dare to argue. He said humbly, please enlighten me. Sang Sang said, Lu Bai dared to attack me, but you don't even dare to attack me. He is the sage of sword. What qualifications do you have to be the sage of calligraphy? From today onwards you will be called Wang Shu. From then on, Sage of Calligraphy Wang changed his name to Sage of Calligraphy Wang, because Hao Yin had removed the word saint from his name. Ning Ke led the big black horse and followed Sang Sang out of the palace. The big black horse carried a huge package on its back. Judging from the faint fragrance, it should be something like cosmetics. There were many flowers and trees in the palace. Walking through the flowers, their clothes were stained with the fragrance of flowers. He looked at Sang Sang's back and thought about what had happened before. He couldn't help laughing. The master of calligraphy has a real name. Sage of calligraphy is an honorific title. If you think he doesn't deserve to be called a sage, just say so. It's ridiculous that you want him to change his name to Wang Shu. Sang Sang stopped and didn't turn around. Her voice was a little indifferent. You said that you are in charge of everything. I think this sentence is even more ridiculous. Ning Ke felt a little uneasy and his body became a little stiff. He forced a smile and explained, I have to save some face in front of outsiders. In fact, you don't know that I can take care of some small things. Sang Sang said, but I think you take care of a lot of things. Ning Ke walked behind her and said, they are all small things. They are all small things. Sang Sang turned around and looked at him. She asked, then what are the big things and what are the small things? Ning Ke said, you are Hao Yin. In your eyes, aren't the things in the human world all small things? Sang Sang thought about it. She felt that what he said was reasonable, but also seemed to be unreasonable. Try to finish the next chapter before 12:30. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 923. Sang Sang had never been a smart person. Even though she had become Hao Yin, she still seemed a little slow in some aspects. That was because the heavenly calculation, which could calculate everything in the world, was best at mathematical inference. When faced with the trivial things in life, it was a little difficult for her to connect. But it didn't mean that she was really slow. As long as she was willing to put her mind on these things, she could find the abominable truth from Ning Ke's words with just a little deduction. Of course, Ning Ke was very clear about this. Before she could react, he continued, you want me to be the emperor of the Great River Kingdom, which is even more ridiculous. Sang Sang said, how is it ridiculous? Ning Ke said, it's unrealistic. Even if the Great River Kingdom doesn't dare to oppose your will under the pressure of the West Hill Divine Palace, we have to go back to Chang'an. Sang Sang said expressionlessly, when did I say I want to go to Chang'an? Ning Ke sighed in his heart and said, but we can't always stay in the Great River Kingdom. Sang Sang said, if you don't want to be the emperor, you can give it to someone else when you leave. Ning Ke thought for a while and said, it's feasible to deal with it this way. The position of the emperor of a country would lead to many bloody conflicts in the secular world. But for Sang Sang and Ning Ke, it was like a toy that came and went at will. Ning Ke said that for Sang Sang the things in the human world were trivial. From this point of view, there was indeed nothing wrong with it. Walking out of the palace, the flower trees gradually faded away. The lonely flower tree in the corner of the imperial city wall became a little more conspicuous. Sang Sang looked at it and said, I just don't want to see that tree cut off. Ning Ke knew that she was explaining why she helped him in the battle and broke the master of calligraphy's big splash ink. He thought that even if she became Hao Yin, she was still so stubborn and thin-skinned. He couldn't help but smile. He didn't want to go deeper into this issue. It was not good to force Sang Sang to say that she cared about him. Instead, it might make her angry. So he naturally changed the topic. On the way, I saw you put a cloud on a branch and thought it was amazing. But after seeing the methods of the master of calligraphy, I think it's just SOSO. He's called Wang Shu now. Besides, as I said, the cloud he put is a little dirty. You can ensure that the clouds you gather are clean? My clouds come from the coast of the Song Nation, thousands of kilometers away, right in the middle of the stormy sea. There are no traces of humans or dust pollution. Naturally, it is absolutely clean. I don't think it's low carbon and environmentally friendly. Don't use the terms from your world. What? Because I don't like it. As they chatted, they left the Great River Palace and came to the royal road covered with red leaves. The big black horse lowered its head and sniffed the faint scent of the maple leaves. Ning Ke looked into the distance and suddenly did not know where to go. Where to next? He looked at Sang Sang and asked, Mogan Mountain, said Sang Sang. After a moment of silence, Ning Ke asked, why? Sang Sang looked at him quietly and asked, don't you want to go? Ning Ke answered without any hesitation, I really don't want to. Sang Sang looked into his eyes and said, I know what you're thinking. Ning Ke was speechless and said, this is really boring. Mogan Mountain was a green and beautiful mountain, about dozens of miles away from Jingdu. For Ning Ke and Sang Sang it didn't take long to get there. At dusk they saw the lake on the mountainside. The hut on the shore of the lake was decorated with colorful clothes and lanterns. In order to welcome the upcoming wedding, it should be quite lively. But somehow no sound could be heard. It was so quiet around the black ink lake. The young lotuses floating in the lake looked at the direction of the hut and seemed a little surprised. Ning Ke and Sang Sang walked to the shore of the lake. They didn't see any guests or disciples of Black Ink Garden along the way. He couldn't help but feel a little strange. When he came to the door of the hut, he pushed the door and entered. Several bright sword lights greeted him. The sword style was sharp and decisive. It was the famous wind chopping of Black Ink Garden. Facing these sharp sword lights, Ning Ke's expression didn't change. He said, it's me. The sword lights suddenly converged and 3 slender swords stopped in front of his eyebrows. When the women holding the swords saw him, they looked surprised and shouted, Ning Ke. Mr. 13. Mr. Ning? Not only the 3 women holding the swords, but at least a dozen disciples of Black Ink Garden in the hut also recognized him and shouted in surprise. Because of habit they all called him differently. Ning Ke and the female disciples of Black Ink Garden were very familiar with each other when they traveled together in the wilderness. Although they had not seen each other for a long time, their friendship had not faded. Ning Ke walked into the hut with a smile and saw Mo Shanshan. She was still wearing the white cotton dress, standing next to a fine yellow horse with a bag tied to the horse's back. It seemed that she was preparing for a long journey. She didn't look like she was going to get married at all. Looking at her, Ning Ke felt a little complicated and didn't know what to say. The big black horse he was leading was much more direct. Looking at the former hostess, it opened its thick lips, showed its white teeth and neighed happily at her. Since the master of calligrapher was going to marry their hill master to the monarch, the disciples of Black Ink Garden had been a little worried. Many people expected Ning Ke to appear. At this time he really appeared and they were naturally surprised. Cat Girl was even more so. She thought that Ning Ke really had a conscience. She didn't let him eat so many snacks by the Blue Kidney Sea in vain. With a silver bell-like laugh she rushed to him. Suddenly her arm was grabbed by Zhuozhihua. Zhuozhihua grabbed her sleeve so hard that her knuckles were clearly pale. Her face also became abnormally pale, and she looked particularly scared. She saw the woman in indigo who came in behind Ning Quebec. The woman in indigo was very tall and a little fat. Her eyes and eyebrows were ordinary, and there was nothing special in her expression. But she just stood there with her hands behind her back as high as the sky. Zhuozhihua was sure that she had never seen her before, but she guessed who she was. So her mind was instantly occupied by fear, and her hand that tightly held Cat Girl was full of sweat. The big black horse suddenly came to its senses and dared not to neigh happily. It winked at Mo Shanshan to express its apology and hurriedly retreated behind Sang Sang, very humble and natural. Sang Sang put her hands behind her back and looked at the cottage of Black Ink Garden with no emotion on her face. Looking at the tall figure of the woman in indigo, the disciples of Black Ink Garden all became pale. At the moment when she saw Ning Ke, there was a trace of joy in Mo Shanshan's lake-like clear eyes. But after seeing Sang Sang, that trace of joy turned into bitterness and confusion. She walked to Sang Sang, gently lifted her white dress and slowly knelt down. Seeing this scene, the disciples of Black Ink Garden confirmed their previous speculation. There was no reason for them not to know Sang Sang's identity. They all walked forward and silently knelt down to her. Sang Sang was looking at the writing brushes hanging between the beams of the cottage. She felt that they were not as good as the cured meat hanging on the beams of the farmhouses in the northern Yen Mountain village last year. She didn't come to her senses until the disciples of Black Ink Garden knelt down. "Get up," she said. Mo Shanshan stood up with her senior sisters and junior sisters and stood aside quietly. Sang Sang looked at her slightly pale cheeks and said, "Are you afraid of me?" Mo Shanshan said, "It's respect, not fear." Sang Sang said, "Then why is your face pale?" Mo Shanshan said, "I've always been very pale." Sang Sang thought for a while. When they met in Chang'an, she was indeed very pale, unlike herself who was very dark at that time and only became pale now. She looked at Mo Shanshan's face and said with some displeasure, "Your face is not as round as before." Emo Shanshan didn't know why she was displeased and said, "There are many mundane things." Sang Sang said, "The engagement has been cancelled. What else is bothering you?" Hearing this, the disciples of Black Ink Garden were surprised at first and then a little confused, because they couldn't understand why Sang Sang would say this. Emo Shanshan looked at her eyes quietly and felt a little grateful, but she didn't say anything. She was the calligraphy addict, the youngest divine talisman master in the world, and the sworn sister of Mr. First of the Academy. The thing that she couldn't solve was naturally love. Sang Sang suddenly said, "It seems that you are really not afraid of me." Emo Shanshan still didn't say anything. She was a believer of Hao Yin, but she had the courage to stand in front of Hao Yin and calmly look at her without retreating. But that didn't mean that she would be rude to Hao Yin. She knew that Hao Yin would definitely understand her thoughts. What was love in the world? It was something that made people live and die for it. If one didn't even care about life and death, what was there to be afraid of? Sang Sang understood what she meant. "I admire you very much." She looked at Emo Shanshan and said, "I don't admire your teacher very much." No one understood the meaning of this sentence, only Ning Ke vaguely understood something. Sang Sang said, "Human beings who dare to compete with me are always more interesting, such as the headmaster of academy, Crazy Ku, Lu Bai, and you. Although you don't have the strength of those three, you are not inferior to them in courage. I actually don't understand the source of this courage." If competing with Hao Yin was against heaven, then Emo Shanshan was against heaven. From the point of view of human beings, he is indeed good to me, so I wanted to grant him immortality, but he refused. If he wants to continue to suffer in the human world, then let him be. Your affairs have nothing to do with me. Sang Sang said, "I am Hao Yin and you are a human being. Our positions are different, so we naturally care about different things. Your courage should fall on him, not on me." Emo Shanshan looked at the tips of her shoes sticking out of her cotton dress and remained silent. Ning Ke, who had been forgotten for a long time, finally couldn't help but say helplessly, "Shouldn't you ask for my opinion on this matter first? Your opinion has never been important." Sang Sang said expressionlessly and walked out of the cottage with her hands behind her back. In the twilight, the ink lake seemed to be burning. The tender green lotus was like a fairy in the fire, looking very beautiful. She sat down by the lake and quietly looked at the world in the lake. Just a moment ago she seemed as high as the sky. At this moment she seems so lonely. "My heart is breaking. My dear Sang Sang." To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 924. Ning Ke and Emo Shanshan sat on the stone chairs in front of the hut facing the lake in the twilight. The big black horse was eating grass not far away. Of course, it would not really swallow the grass into its stomach. It was just eating to kill time. Ning Ke told her what happened in the capital city. Emo Shanshan's slender eyelashes flickered gently. She looked down at the tips of her shoes and remained silent. Even when she heard that her teacher was seriously injured, her expression didn't change. She was only a little surprised when she heard that Ning Ke had become the emperor of the Great River Kingdom. She didn't say nonsense like those women who had been influenced by novels about gifted scholars and beautiful women for a long time. Since he didn't want to marry her, why didn't he want her to marry someone else? In Chang'an, you said that this time she went to the sky and couldn't come back, so you couldn't do anything about it. Now that she has returned to the human world, what do you think? Ning Ke said, "I found that I thought too simply. In fact, no matter if she went to the sky or the human world, she would always be there. There was nothing I could do." Emo Shanshan said, "She is not her anymore. She is Hao Yin. Can you still love her like this?" Ning Ke thought about it and said, "I have thought about this. She is Hao Yin, but she has all the memories of Sang Sang and me. How can I say that she isn't Sang Sang?" He was silent for a while and continued, "I know that no one will like her, but I don't care. In fact, I have never cared about this since a long time ago. This is probably true love." Emo Shanshan raised her head and quietly looked into his eyes. "What about me?" she asked. Ning Ke was silent. Emo Shanshan said in a low voice, "You are a heartless man." Ning Ke said, "From a certain point of view, I am indeed a heartless man." Emo Shanshan smiled and said, "But it's better than not being a heartless man. Once faced with a choice, one would have to let one side down. If he didn't want to let Shanshan down, he would have to let Sang Sang down. If he didn't want to let both of them down, he would be a playboy. Most men were playboys. Some could let everyone down, but he couldn't. The most important thing was that neither Sang Sang nor Shanshan would accept him." Ning Ke thought for a long time and said while looking at the beautiful Sang Sang, "You are so nice." As soon as he said that, he felt like an idiot. I also think I'm a very good girl. Mo Shanshan looked in the direction of the lake and lamented, but it's still not enough. In the end I can't win this war. But it's heaven that wants to defeat me. It's not my fault. The last rays of the setting sun shone on the tranquil lake between the cliffs. The sky gradually darkened, and the surface of the lake was suffused with golden ripples. The lake water seemed to become deeper and drifted with the wind, like ink in an ink stone. Sang Sang sat by the lake. Although her figure seemed a little lonely, it was still as high as the sky. Mo Shanshan looked in that direction and was silent for a long time. Then, as if she was afraid of the cold, she put her legs back on the chair and hugged her knees tightly. She asked, "Do you still like me?" Ning Ke thought for a while and answered honestly, "Yes." She said, "But you still don't like it enough." The not enough referred to herself and the not enough referred to him. What should Ning Ke say? She hugged her knees and said sadly, "You still like her more." The skirt on her knees was wet from her tears. In the eyes of the world, she was a quiet and gentle woman who didn't care about worldly affairs and was obsessed with Fu books. She knew how to live, had no vulgar charm and was sensible and upright. As she said before, she was the best. Who would have thought that she would cry for a man? This was the first time that Ning Ke saw her cry. He was very flustered and didn't know what to do or say. In the end he said, "Can you be happier if you kill me?" He was not joking at this time. He was telling the truth. Some things were too heavy for him to repay. What should he do? He subconsciously offered the most important thing in his life with both hands, which was life and death. People only have one life. If you give it to me, what about her? Or are you used to giving it to others? Then who are you going to give it to? Why are you so? Mo Shanshan said with tears. Today was the first time that she cried in front of others, and it was also the first time that she wanted to swear. But at the last moment she still held back. Ning Ke had done many things in his life that could not be exposed to the world. He knew that he was cold-blooded and ruthless. In the eyes of the world he was undoubtedly a scum, but he never cared about it. Until he saw Mo Shanshan's tears, he realized that it was not so easy to be a scum. It was quiet in front of the hut. The twilight gradually faded, and the shadow cast by the tree behind the chair gradually spread until it merged with the night. No one spoke for a long time. "Where will you go next?" she asked in a slightly hoarse voice. Ning Ke said, "I don't know where the end is." Mo Shanshan looked up at him and asked with concern, "Is it hard?" Ning Ke said, "It's bearable." Whether it was for the world or for himself, he had to continue this journey. But since they were traveling together, how could he be the only one who felt tired? Just as he was thinking about this, Mo Shanshan looked at Sang Sang's back in the night by the lake and said with mixed emotions, "I guess it's hard for her too." Sang Sang had been sitting by the lake. She first looked at the few green lotuses in the lake and calculated that on the morning 28 days later, the green lotuses, which looked so young now, would be as fluffy as a fan and give birth to a very beautiful lotus. Then she looked at the lake and calculated that in 3,744 years, the underground river at the foot of Mogan Mountain would be connected to the belly of the mountain. At that time, the rippling lake would disappear without a trace. Catgirl walked over timidly and offered a cup of tea with both hands. She looked very nervous and wanted to leave, but Sang Sang asked her to stay and talk with her. Sang Sang liked little girls because she used to be a little girl. But Catgirl did not know that talking with Hao Yin was too stressful for her. Gossip should be said casually. If the other party was too nervous, it would be difficult to continue. Sang Sang frowned slightly and felt a little bored, so she waved her hand to let her go. Sang Sang continued to look at the lake, trying to figure out whether the lake would disappear in advance because of the landslide 600 years later. But she found it a little messy, and suddenly thought of Yanming Lake in Chang'an. She looked at the green lotuses in the lake and thought of those lotus flowers in Yanming Lake. It doesn't matter. I just have a deep impression of those lotus flowers because I planted them myself. Sang Sang said quietly, but she knew it was just an excuse. Night fell and she looked up at the stars. The stars were extremely complicated in the eyes of humans, but in her eyes, they were actually very simple numbers, much simpler than things in the human world. She thought it was boring. Human beings always like to make things complicated, because only in this way would they find it interesting and meaningful to live. The stars in the night sky quietly looked at the earth. The position of those stars and the distance between them had not changed for countless years. She suddenly found that compared with the position in the divine kingdom, the stars on the ground always seemed a little monotonous and boring, although they were equally beautiful. "No, silence is the real beauty," she said quietly. Silence is beauty. This was the idea of Haotian Taoism because the distribution of the stars in the sky was Haotian. so naturally it could not be changed. At this moment, the cloud in the southwest of the night sky was blown away by the wind, and a round moon appeared. The moonlight shone on the earth and the night itself. The starlight that seemed to be stagnant suddenly became lively, and the whole world became lively. Sang Sang narrowed her eyes, which were like willow leaves and looked very bright. But her eyes were a little confused. Hao Yin came to the human world, which sounded like a god coming to the world. In fact, when the rules left the objective field of rules and came to the human world, it was like a baby coming to a new world. Newborn babies relied on their instincts to survive, and only through learning could they grow up. She also relied on her instincts to survive in the human world, but her instincts were cold rules and logic, and the warm things in this world were too strange to her. She was very clumsy in learning. She was very lonely, and without Ning Ke she would be even more lonely. Mo Shanshan looked at Sang Sang's back by the lake and said lovingly, "She is really pitiful." Ning Ke looked at that place, and after a moment of silence he said, "She definitely doesn't like to hear that from humans. But you are right, she is really pitiful." Mo Shanshan said, "You have to take good care of her." Ning Ke thought of the torture in the West Hill Divine Palace and on the journey, and said with a self-mocking smile, "I am also pitiful." Mo Shanshan said, "Am I not pitiful?" Ning Ke was about to speak when he suddenly felt something wet on his face. Mo Shanshan kissed him gently. He was a little stunned. She was a little shy, not because she wanted to snatch anything, but to express and satisfy her feelings. Ning Ke was a little nervous and glanced at the lake. Mo Shanshan looked at the lake and whispered, "Why does it feel like they are having an affair?" Ning Ke smiled bitterly and was speechless. Mo Shanshan said, "Don't worry." Ning Ke said, "I am not worried about her." Mo Shanshan couldn't help but laugh when she saw his cowardly appearance. Ning Ke said, "I am worried about you." Mo Shanshan smiled and said, "You don't have to worry about me. In fact, I have already figured it out." Ning Ke said, "You can figure it out?" "I can't figure it out no matter how I think about it." Mo Shanshan smiled and said, "I met you more than 10 years later than she did. Hao Yin also has a way to reverse time, let alone a mortal like me. You should go with her. If she really returns to the divine kingdom and never comes back, or if she doesn't want you anymore, you can come to me. Before that, I will live a good life. I will find a good man." Hearing this, Ning Ke subconsciously wanted to say, "Where can you find a good man like me?" But he suddenly realized that if he really said it, he would be too much of a scumbag. Mo Shanshan knew what he wanted to say. She pursed her thin red lips and didn't let herself laugh out loud. She said, "There are not many women as good as me, and there are many men who are better than you." Ning Ke was a little embarrassed and hurt his self-esteem. Mo Shanshan suddenly said, "I like you." The moonlight fell on her face, which was very beautiful. Red walls and white snow. If you like her, how can you forget? But I also like you like her. She smiled and said, "I like you like her like this." Ning Ke didn't say anything and just smiled. "I like you too," he said in his heart. "I like you like me like her like this." He got up and walked out of the shadow of the trees and came to the lake. He looked at Sang Sang's back and said, "Let's go." Sang Sang stood up and looked at him. She wanted to say something but she said nothing. The trip continued again. Someone saw them off by the lake with a fluttering white dress. The first year of the Tang Empire, the 3450 year of Daji of West Hill, the 14th year of Chongqing of Great River. 2,000 cavalrymen of West Hill Divine Palace crossed the river. A young man and a young woman came to the Great River Kingdom. The monarch abdicated. The Great River Kingdom changed its name to Shi Huan. She refers to the sun. Huan refers to a stream in the southern kingdom. Thousands of acacia trees were planted by the stream. The new monarch was a woman. On the day of her coronation, the woman didn't wear the national uniform, but still wore a fluttering white dress. This story starts from the red walls and white snow long ago. It is about love. The last 2 sentences of love today are all my views and all my pursuit of love. As for the specifics, I will give everyone a detailed report and explain my understanding in a later chapter, or in the epilogue after I finish writing Jia. This chapter took a lot of effort to write and I really hope that you can accept it and like it. Half of my life is gone, so I only have 1 chapter today. After finishing, I found that I couldn't find any suitable words to name the chapter, so I had to leave it untitled. Tomorrow I will write 2 chapters. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 925. Ning Ke and Sang Sang walked down the mountain. The trees by the road became more and more luxuriant, and the moonlight fell on them, making them look a little dim. Sang Sang said, I thought she was one of the most courageous human beings and would keep you here. I didn't expect that you would successfully escape from the mountain. Ning Ke felt that there was something wrong with her words. He said, I know you want me to stay, or you wouldn't have said those words to her in the beginning. Sang Sang said, I don't have any thoughts. Ning Ke stopped and threw the reins to the back of the black horse. He looked at her quietly and said after a long silence, I think you are a little afraid of me now. Sang Sang squinted her bright willowy eyes and said, I think you are sick. Ning Ke thought for a while and said, Are you starting to be afraid? Sang Sang said expressionlessly, lowly human. Before she finished her words, Ning Ke waved his hand and said, You can repeat this sentence 30,000 times, but it won't change the fact. You are afraid after all. You are afraid of being kept in the human world by me. Sang Sang thought for a while and said, I am not happy. Ning Ke thought that she was saying that he was too confident, so he explained with a smile when she was unhappy, It doesn't mean that I am better than you. It just means that you know how good I am to you. Sang Sang looked at a certain part of his face and said nothing. Ning Ke then understood what she meant and felt a little embarrassed. He thought that since she had seen it, why didn't she throw a tantrum before, but now she brought it up again. Wasn't it annoying? Although he thought so, he didn't dare to say it out. Although Sang Sang knew what he was thinking, it made a difference whether he said it out or not. Having a thief in your heart and being a thief were two different things. There was a clear stream beside the road. He walked to the stream and squatted down. He washed his face with the stream water, especially the part that was kissed by Shan Shan. He even washed it very carefully until it was a little red. Ning Ke walked back to her and pointed at his slightly red cheeks. He said, Is it okay now? Sang Sang frowned slightly and shook her head. Obviously she was still not satisfied. Ning Ke said helplessly, If I wash it again even the skin will be rubbed off. Sang Sang's willowy eyes suddenly brightened. Ning Ke's words had provided her with a very good idea. On the mountain path, there was a sudden gust of cold wind that brushed past his cheeks. Ning Ke cried out in pain and covered his cheek. His eyes were filled with shock and disbelief. His fingers did not bleed, because Sang Sang's movements were very fast. The moment the wind cut off the flesh on his face, she healed him back to his original state. Ning Ke touched his face and found no blood or wound. However, he clearly knew what had happened at that moment. The pain and fear were still in his heart. You crazy woman! He couldn't stand it anymore and shouted at Sang Sang, You vicious woman! I am your man. It's not like you roasted the meat stick. Sang Sang did not have any intuitive knowledge about pain. She could only analyze the data calmly. She had thought that Ning Ke should have gotten used to it after being cut into pieces so many times in the Divine Hall of Light in the U prison. She did not expect him to react so violently at this time. She could not help but feel puzzled. She did not understand that this kind of thing was very humiliating to a man. The most important thing was that it easily reminded Ning Ke of the greatest humiliation that he still maintained until today. The most important thing was that in the West Hill Divine Palace, they were enemies who shared life and death, but now their relationship had subtly changed. That was why Ning Ke was so angry. Although Sang Sang did not understand the change, she could feel that Ning Ke was really angry. After a moment of silence, she said, I will tell you in advance in the future. She told him in advance before cutting his flesh so that he could be mentally prepared. If others heard this, they would inevitably feel that she was ridiculing Ning Quebec. Ning Ke knew that she was not ridiculing him. For Hao Yin, it was a rare kindness to tell him before doing something. It even vaguely represented some kind of apology. Hao Yin would not apologize to humans. Even if she felt that it was inappropriate, she would not say it. Ning Ke comforted himself in this way. He felt very comforted, but then he felt that he was really cheap. Forget it. Don't do it again, he said. Sang Sang ignored him and walked down the mountain with her hands clasped behind her back. The big black horse glanced at Ning Ke with disdain, and then followed up with a jolt. Ning Ke felt very bored. He quickened his pace and walked behind her. He said earnestly, This kind of thing is not interesting. Besides, you cut my flesh and have to make it grow again. It will consume a lot of divine power. Sang Sang said, I like it. Ning Ke scolded, What is yours is mine, and your divine power is my divine power. It may be of great use in the future. How can you waste it like this? What a spendthrift woman. Sang Sang stopped and turned to look at him. She said, Say that again. When Ning Ke heard this, he suddenly felt that she was very much like those barbarians in Chang and who would start a fight at the slightest disagreement. So he replied sincerely, I said, You can do whatever you want. When they returned to the outskirts of Jingdu, the night was half gone and the morning light was shining. They could vaguely see the buildings with black eaves in the city. It was very beautiful. However, the dense torches added a lot of tension to the atmosphere. The monarch was forced to abdicate, and 2,000 cavalrymen of the Westhill Divine Palace crossed the river. Tonight, the Great River Kingdom was facing unprecedented turbulence. Who could sleep peacefully in Jingdu? Before leaving Mogan Mountain, Ning Ke had already told Mo Shanshan about this matter. He knew that the chaos and turbulence would end tomorrow, but there were still some unanswered questions in his heart. The position of the monarch of the Great River Kingdom has been taken over by Shanshan. You should have known this beforehand. So I don't understand why you wanted me to be the monarch in the palace. What's the point of letting me take over? Some things are meaningless but they are interesting. For some reason, Sang Sang liked to mention the words meaning and meaning recently. It felt like she was mocking the Academy's principles of life. For example? He asked. Sang Sang said, second brother Wu and his woman, who lived next door, had a conversation. Ning Ke shook his head and said, they quarrel every day. How can I remember everything they said? Sang Sang said, the woman said that second brother Wu could not marry a concubine, unless he could become the emperor. Ning Ke thought of this matter and was speechless. He looked at her and said, just because of this, you want me to be the monarch of the Great River Kingdom, even if it's only for one night? Sang Sang said, monarch for one night and also once a monarch. Ning Ke was very helpless and said, Hao Yin is indeed a busybody. Sang Sang ignored his mockery and said, you said that I owe a lot of people in the world so I can't cut them off because they can't be repaid. You mentioned this couple. Ning Ke said, are you repaying the debt? Sang Sang said, yes, second brother Wu's debt should be repaid. Ning Ke said, but won't you feel sorry for Aunt Wu? Sang Sang thought about it and found it reasonable. She said, I'll find a way to repay her later. Ning Ke said, how? You want to give her immortality? Be careful, she will be scared to death when she hears this. Immortality? I really don't know what you are thinking about. Sang Sang was not angry and said, what I am thinking, of course a lowly human like you doesn't know. Ning Ke was very angry and said, see, every time you say you can't win you say this. Can't you say something new? Sang Sang said calmly, you lowly human? Ning Ke could not do anything to her, so he walked toward the east looking a little unhappy. Sang Sang walked behind him and asked, why are you unhappy? Ning Ke did not look back and said, you took the throne of the Great River Kingdom, just to let second brother Wu marry a concubine. You also owe me a lot. Why don't you find a way for me to marry more? Sang Sang said, because I don't want to, so don't even think about it. He and Sang Sang chatted all the way, getting farther and farther away from the capital. As time passed, the morning light gradually became brighter, and the bright red sun finally jumped out of the ground. There were early vendors by the road. They did not know what had happened in the capital city, and the whole Great River Kingdom was nervously preparing for the war. As usual, they were boiling water and preparing to cook noodles. Sang Sang stopped by the stall and said, a bowl of noodles? Ning Ke walked back and added, 2 bowls? Then he looked at the rising sun in the east and said with emotion, it really looks like a salted duck egg yolk. The noodle stall owner was also an interesting person, so he said, there is no salted duck egg but there is fried egg. Ning Ke was slightly stunned when he heard fried egg. Sang Sang said, 1 for each bowl. Under the warm morning light and the rising sun, the two squatted under the willow tree by the road and began to eat fried egg noodles. Ning Ke had been hungry for a long time, so he ate very carelessly like running water. Sang Sang did not make any sound while eating, but her speed was not any slower than Ning Ke's. There was no expression on her face, but Ning Ke knew that she was very happy. Since leaving the Westhill Divine Palace, Sang Sang would occasionally smile, but most of the time she was still emotionless. He had long learned to judge her mood from other aspects, such as the speed at which she ate, the speed at which she ate the noodles, and the way she looked at the cotton candy. Ning Ke finished the noodles in his bowl, but the fried egg was still there. Since he was very young, he had been used to eating noodles first, then fried egg. This was because he had been through too many hard times. He picked up the fried egg in the bowl but did not put it into his mouth. Instead he put it into her bowl. Sang Sang glanced at him, did not thank him, and did not say anything but ate it directly. Since she was very young, she had been used to him giving her the delicious food first. The big black horse stood at the side and lowered its head to chew the flowers in the morning light. It sucked the dew off and spat out the flower dregs. It looked very carefree and had the temperament of an immortal. In fact, it was in a bad mood because it had no noodles to eat, and it had not eaten the yellow fruit for a few days. What annoyed it most was that Ning Kai and Sang Sang seemed to have forgotten its existence. It thought bitterly, "You can show off your love, but you will be annoyed one day." There was a saying that a prophecy could become a prophecy, which described the big black horse's jinx. After leaving the capital city, they walked along the official road for more than half a day. Suddenly, smoke and dust filled the sky in the distance, and the earth began to shake uneasily. Countless cavalrymen in black armor broke through the smoke with an imposing manner. 2,000 cavalrymen of the Divine Halls from the distant West Hill crossed the river to the south, broke through the Guanbei commandery and finally arrived. Looking at these dusty cavalrymen of the Divine Halls, Ning Kai frowned slightly and felt a little annoyed. After he and Sang Sang jumped off the cliff into the abyss and left the Peach Mountain, the West Hill Divine Palace had been guarding this secret. Even bigwigs like the Master of Calligrapher did not receive any news. If the news that Haoyin had left the West Hill was spread out, how could Haoyin Taoism be at peace? At the same time, the West Hill Divine Palace was constantly looking for traces of Sang Sang, trying to bring her back to the West Hill. Ning Kai and Sang Sang traveled in the world, and did not deliberately cover their tracks. For a giant like the West Hill Divine Palace, it was not difficult to find them. In order to prevent the secret from leaking and because they did not know Haoyin's arrangement, the West Hill Divine Palace sent out 2,000 cavalrymen, but did not dare to approach until Ning Kai and Sang Sang walked into the palace of the Great River Kingdom. Since Haoyin had shown the divine miracle in the human world, it was meaningless to keep it a secret. Of course, the Divine Halls had to take action. 2,000 cavalrymen of the Divine Halls crossed the river and traveled day and night, and finally appeared in front of Ning Kai and Sang Sang. The smoke and dust gradually settled, and the cavalrymen of the Divine Halls stopped a few miles away, not daring to approach. In the dusk they could vaguely see a horse coming with dust, probably to meet Haoyin, but they did not know who was on the horse. Ning Kai glanced at Sang Sang a little worried. He was worried that she would really choose to go back to the West Hill with these cavalrymen. Just like last night, she was worried that he would really stay by the Ink Lake. Looking at those human beings who were loyal to her, Sang Sang said after a moment of silence, "Do you have any place you want to go?" Ning Kai thought for a moment and said, "What do you want to see?" Sang Sang said, "I want to see the sea." They turned to the south because there was a sea in the south. In the camp of the cavalrymen of the Divine Halls of West Hill, some chaos could be seen. The horse coming with dust slowly stopped, and a touch of bright red could be vaguely seen on it. It did not take long for the cavalrymen of the Divine Halls of West Hill to start their journey to the south. In the fields of the Great River Kingdom, the smoke and dust were everywhere, and the sound of hooves could be heard. The cavalrymen of the Divine Halls seemed very silent, but in their silence, they had their own sense of toughness. They did not care whether the Great River Kingdom would send troops to intercept them or whether they would be attacked. The cavalrymen of the Divine Halls seemed very silent, with a sense of humility. They followed the two people and a horse in front of them from a distance of more than 10 miles, and did not dare to move forward or leave. The scene in the fields of the south of the Great River Kingdom looked extremely shocking and strange. Countless smoke and dust followed the tall figure in the sunset. Where would it go? Ning Kai and Sang Sang came to the seaside. The sea in the south was not as violent as the sea in the Kingdom of Song, but seemed very calm. The wind on the sea was very gentle, but it was different in the sky. The clouds hanging in the blue sky were rolled into various shapes, and there were light waves on the sea with various kinds of blue. The big black horse rushed into the blue sea, neighing happily. Ning Kai and Sang Sang walked to the beach and looked at the sea quietly. There was wind and rain on the sea. Everyone, this chapter of 4,000 words was written in an hour. Of course, it took me a lot of time to revise it, but it is still the fastest speed in my life. I want to tell you the good news. It seems that writing the plot I like is really the best thing. There is another chapter of 2,000 words, and it may be updated very late because I haven't eaten yet. Just now the cat vomited behind me. It seems that it is very dissatisfied with my complacency and looks down on me. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 926. The wind was strong and the rain was heavy. They came from the depths of the South Sea. Countless raindrops fell, turning the beach muddy. The blue sea became darker because of the restlessness. The big black horse ran back from the sea and wanted to hide from the rain under a tree behind the beach. But it found Ning Kai and Sang Sang standing still by the beach. It thought for a while and came back, standing behind them silently. The rain kept dripping down its mane, which made it look miserable and pitiful. Sang Sang looked in front of her quietly. Neither the sea rain nor the wind could leave any trace in her eyes. The violent nature seemed to have no rules, but in fact there were rules everywhere. There were rules in the sea, in the wind, and in the sea. She stood between the sky and the sea, but there were rules everywhere. She did not know where the destination of this journey was. Ning Ke brought her to the human world to let her experience and deepen the bond between her and the human world. She chose to leave the Peach Mountain with him, not only to prove that heaven's way could not be violated, but also to find a way to leave the human world. She chose to come to the great river to experience the deepest love that kept her in the human world. But it was not enough. It was not enough for Ning Ke to keep her, and it was not enough for her to find a way to leave the human world. She was a little emotional, so there was a storm by the beach. She unconsciously showed her heaven's way to Ning Ke, but he chose not to see it. The beach was washed by the storm and there were many small mudslides. The remains of some sea creatures buried under the sand, and the glass beads buried by the urchins were all exposed. Ning Ke squatted down and picked up a beautiful shell from the sand. Then the storm stopped. "I think I am the sea." She wanted to see the sea, so she came to the beach and said, "The sea has no shape. The waves will be how the wind blows." This was the first time she talked about herself to Ning Quebec. She talked about herself as Haotian. Ning Ke understood what she meant, and his mood became a little complicated. For Haotian Taoism believers, Haotian was the only indescribable and inexplicable dominator, the only true God that ruled the world. But he knew it was wrong. In the restaurant in the Kingdom of Song, the headmaster pointed to the sky with chopsticks and said that Haotian was the collection of objective rules, and its life was the inertia of the rules. So when did the objective rules of the world start to have life? If Haotian was an objective will, then who had awakened it in the beginning? This was undoubtedly the most difficult question in the world to answer. Even the most knowledgeable theology instructor of the West Hill Divine Palace could not and dared not answer it. The Academy had analyzed this, but there was no conclusion. With Ning Ke's current state, it was impossible for him to get the real answer. But she was his natal, so he knew. The awakening of objective will came from human belief. Countless reincarnations ago, humans were no longer ignorant and began to explore this world. They understood and grasped many of the rules of this world. Some people were fearless because of this, while others were filled with reverence. Taoism represented humanity and chose to let her protect this world. With the start of faith, humanity's collective consciousness became so strong that it was strong enough to wake her up. She woke up and had her own life. Just as the humans had prayed, she turned into a tranquil sea and silently protected the world. Humans were afraid of the world at the bottom of the sea and on the other side of the sea, so they chose you to protect them. Ning Ke threw the shell in his hand into the sea and looked into the depths of the sea. He said, when human curiosity or the desire for freedom exceeded their fear, they wanted to build ships and even swim with their bare hands. They wanted to swim across the sea and see what was at the bottom of the sea and on the other side. Sang Sang was silent. Her existence was not her own choice but the choice of humans. If she wanted to change this world and break the shackles of rules, what would happen to her? Ning Ke turned around and looked at her quietly. Then he held her in his arms. Sang Sang was expressionless and let him hold her. Ning Ke said, "I suddenly have a place I want to show you." She asked, "Where?" Ning Ke said, "You have been there? After seeing the sea, let's go to the mountain, the Wa Mountain." The two people and a horse left the seaside and walked eastward along the sea. The cavalrymen of the West Hill Divine Palace gathered in the fields about 10 miles away from the South Sea. After a while, the cavalrymen started their journey again. They were covered with dust and walked slowly. The Wa Mountain was not far from the sea and it was very early in spring. When Ning Ke and Sang Sang arrived at the small town in front of the Wa Mountain, there were many new leaves on the branches beside the road. Although they were not as flowering as the great river in the South Sea, the green and tender leaves were pleasing. A few years ago, the Lank Temple suffered a disaster and half of the temple was destroyed. Although it had been renovated, the project was too big and it could not be restored in a short time. The Yulan Hungry Ghost Festival had not been held for a long time. The town, which used to prosper because of tourists, was now deserted. It was not appropriate to say that it was deserted, because the dull knocking sounds could be heard everywhere in the town. Both adults and children were knocking stones and handing them to the craftsmen to carve into Buddha statues. I heard from eldest brother in Guanhai that the people in the town now make Buddha statues for a living. After the Buddha statue on the mountain collapsed, there were stones all over the mountain and valley, so we don't have to worry about raw materials. Ning Ke said to Sang Sang and then led the big black horse to the front yard of the Lank Temple. The front yard of the old temple, where countless stories had happened, was especially quiet now. The reception monk in front of the temple was shocked when he heard Ning Kei's identity and hurriedly rang the welcoming bell. It was raining when they entered the Lank temple. The rain in early spring was often called the happy rain. Ning Kei actually did not like this kind of cold and unpleasant rain, but he could not help but laugh when he saw the rain flowing on Monk Guanhai's bald head. Monk Guanhai felt a little helpless. He put his palms together and said, "Senior brother has just escaped from a great disaster, but he is still so naughty." During the rite to light, he had witnessed Ning Kei frightening everyone at the front yard of the Peach Mountain. Then he entered the Divine Hall of Light and never came out again. At this time he naturally thought that Ning Kei had escaped from the Peach Mountain. Ning Kei said with a smile, "It's natural to escape from a disaster." Monk Guanhai smiled and shook his head. Then he noticed the tall woman beside him. She was standing in front of him in the cold spring rain, but he did not see her. Monk Guanhai's expression froze. He did not know who she was. "Sang Sang." Ning Kei said, "You have seen her before, my wife?" Monk Guanhai's face became extremely pale. He had seen Sang Sang before, but he had not seen her now. Although the West Hill Divine Palace had kept it a secret and he did not know that Sang Sang had left the Peach Mountain with Ning Kei, he knew that Sang Sang was Haotian. Did this mean that he had seen Haotian? Ning Kei said, "Calm down. I don't want to see you scared to death." It took a long time for Monk Guanhai to digest the shock in his heart. Fortunately, he was a senior monk of the Buddhism sect and not a believer of Haotian. Otherwise he might have been scared to death. Sang Sang looked at the old temple in the rain and was lost in thought. Only then did she come to her senses. She looked at Ning Kei and said, "What did you say I was to you?" Ning Kei opened the big black umbrella to shelter her from the rain and said, "You will be scared to death if I say it, so I won't say it." 2 chapters completed. I feel refreshed. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 927. The air in the old temple was very fresh in the spring rain. The huge cliff stones that had crushed the back temple into ruins gave off a sense of dilapidation, and the drizzle also became dreary. Because of Sang Sang's identity, Monk Guanhai did not dare to let the other monks accompany him. He walked in the rain with Ning Kei and Sang Sang. When they reached the Tianyin Hall, a monk hurried to report. "The cavalry of the West Hill Divine Palace has arrived at the foot of the mountain." The monk's face was a little pale. He did not know what had happened. Why did the cavalry of the West Hill Divine Palace suddenly appear in front of the Lank Temple? What did Haotian Taoism want? Monk Guanhai guessed that the cavalry of the West Hill Divine Palace was related to Ning Kei and Sang Sang, but he had misunderstood the cause and effect. His expression became a little solemn and nervous. Ning Kei said, "Don't worry, they won't enter the temple." Although he said so, Monk Guanhai could not really rest assured. The Lank Temple was surrounded by the cavalry, which was a sign that the temple would be destroyed and the monks would die. The other side would definitely want them to hand over Sang Sang. "They are not here to catch a fugitive." Ning Kei was a little embarrassed and said, "Just think of these cavalry as her bodyguards." Monk Guanhai came to his senses and thought, "I see." Seeing that he was still a little uneasy, Ning Kei let him go to the front temple to deal with the affairs. Monk Guanhai said, "The distinguished guest has come from afar. As the abbot of the temple, of course I have to accompany her." Ning Kei said, "A husband and wife stroll in the rain while a big bald head stands by the side. What is this?" Monk Guanhai said, "The back temple is broken and it is not easy to walk." Ning Kei said, "You are joking again?" Monk Guanhai laughed and thought that his words were indeed unreasonable. There was no difficulty in the world that could stop Ning Kei, not to mention that Haotian was by his side. The big black umbrella was like a black lotus, blooming in the drizzle. The big black horse did not have an umbrella and was a little embarrassed by the rain, so it was naturally angry. Ning Kei did not care about its feelings. He held the umbrella and walked around the temple casually with Sang Sang. That autumn, they had lived here for a long time and were very familiar with everything in the old temple. Even though the misty rain obscured their eyes, they would not go the wrong way. Ning Kei first went to the pagoda forest and stood quietly in front of the moss-covered tomb for a while. He said, "Long time no see," to the dancer in the tomb who had completely changed the situation of the cultivation world. Next he passed through the roofed corridor and came to the meditation room where he used to live. Then he went to the side hall and pondered over the stone statues of the venerable ones. Finally he walked toward the ruined halls in the back of the temple. The main hall of the back temple of the Lank Temple had completely collapsed. Moss had already grown on the cliff rocks. Broken Buddha statues could occasionally be seen among the rocks, giving off a sense of vicissitudes. Standing in front of the dilapidated old temple and looking at the boulders all over the mountain, Ning Ke was silent. After entering the Lank temple, Sang Sang had not spoken a single word, whether it was in front of the tomb, in front of the hall, or in front of the mausoleum-like hall. The Lank temple had changed the fates of Kaharan and Lian Sheng, as well as Ning Ke and Sang Sang. In the autumn of a few years ago, he had brought Sang Sang here to cure her illness and learn Buddhism. Sang Sang's identity was exposed and she became the daughter of Yama, who the world wanted to kill. They had escaped from here through the Buddhist chessboard to the Shenkong temple, to the Yueluan temple and then to the eastern wilderness. They had met the headmaster of the academy and gone out to sea on a boat. Now they were back here again. Too many things had happened in these years. Ning Ke looked at the ruined hall and recalled what they had done here. His emotions became very complicated. The thousands of miles of escape and the life and death together were all fake. It was just a trap set by Haotian. This trap deceived him, the headmaster of the academy, and even she herself did not know it. Standing in front of the hall in the rain, Ning Ke thought of the conversation with Master Qishan. He subconsciously looked at Sang Sang beside him and thought, Heaven's will is indeed unpredictable. They left the back hall through the gap in the giant stone. They walked past the broken temple wall of the Lank temple and came to the depths of the Hua mountain. They walked along the mountain path, past the chessboard under the tree, crossed the bridge over the stream, looked at the trees in the rain and came to the meditation room on the mountainside. The furnishings in the small courtyard were still simple and clean. The cotton mattress on the bed was still soft. There was a fan-shaped stone window on the garden wall. Standing in front of the window, one could see the Hua mountain in the misty rain. At that time Sang Sang was seriously ill and coughed on the bed. She said many things to him and told him many of her last words. He stood in front of the stone window and kept silent for a long time. He stood in front of the stone window as if it had happened again. Sang Sang walked to his side and coughed softly. Ning Ke turned to look at her and said, "Do you want to wash your feet with hot water?" Sang Sang was silent. It was not that she was lost because of the past but because she was really ill. This illness was called weakness. Since she came to the human world and woke up among the broken peaks, she had been getting weaker and weaker. Her body became heavier and her divine power became less and less. This was the human world full of the red dust, not the cold and objective divine kingdom. The longer she stayed in the human world, the weaker she would become. She was still very strong now, more powerful than all the cultivators in the human world combined. But compared to her in the divine kingdom, she had become much weaker. Because of her weakness, she began to be sentimental. They left the courtyard and came to the top of the Hua mountain. The stone statue of Buddha that used to reach the clouds was now only left with a small part of its body. Traces of the flowing clouds on the Kasaya could be vaguely seen. Most of it had been cut into stone by Jun Mo's sword. Sang Sang looked at the sky quietly with her hands behind her back. There used to be the merciful and calm face of Buddha, but now there was nothing but the rain. But she still looked at that place quietly as if she was looking at Buddha's face. No one knew what she was thinking. Ning Ke felt a little uneasy and asked, "What are you looking at?" Sang Sang looked at the empty face of Buddha in the rain sky and said, "I have seen him." Ning Ke thought that Buddha was one of the most powerful people in countless samsara. Since you were Haotian, you would naturally have a relatively deep impression of him, just like how you had seen the headmaster. Sang Sang knew what he was thinking and said, "No, I have seen him." Ning Ke was a little confused and said, "Of course you have seen him when Buddha was alive." Sang Sang said, "No, Buddha did not dare to let me see him when he was alive." Ning Ke frowned slightly and asked, "Then when did you see him?" Sang Sang said, "Just a moment ago." Ning Ke was silent for a long time and said, "When you saw this broken Buddha statue?" Sang Sang said, "I saw him before I looked up at him." Ning Ke did not understand what she meant, but he vaguely inferred a very shocking fact from her words. "You mean, Buddha did not really reach nirvana? He is still alive?" Sang Sang said, "He is dead but he is still alive." Ning Ke felt that what she said was too profound. Sang Sang looked back at him and said, "Or, he is alive and dead at the same time." Ning Ke looked at the broken stone statue of Buddha and at the place where there was nothing in the rain sky. The big black umbrella tilted backward because of his movement. The rain fell on his face, which was a little wet and cold. He seemed to see Buddha smiling in the rain, and his compassionate face was full of tears. He said, "I still don't understand." Sang Sang walked behind the lotus seat of the Buddha statue and said, "It is the cat you mentioned." Ning Ke recalled that many years ago in Min Mountain, there was a night when he was too bored and she refused to sleep, so he told her a terrible story. The protagonist of the story was a cat with the surname Shui. For him, the living and dead cat was just a little puzzling, but for a 3-year-old girl, it was natural that she felt it was very scary. Ning Kei looked at the non-existent Buddha statue in the rain sky and suddenly felt scared. The spring rain unexpectedly became heavier, and the mountain road became wet and slippery. Ning Kei took Sang Sang into the cave at the back of the mountain to take a rest. The rain came at the right time. Ning Kei put away the big black umbrella and sat on the futon beside the stone table. He looked at the mountain vines above his head, which were hit by the rain, and said, "I plan to take you here to see." The cave was the residence of Master Qishan. He and Sang Sang had once played a game of chess here. They used the chessboard of Buddha and put down a black chess piece. There were countless tribulations in the game. "Why did you bring me to the Lank Temple?" Sang Sang asked. Ning Kei said, "I wanted to take you to see the old temple and solve some problems." Sang Sang sat in front of the table and said, "Continue." Ning Kei said, "You were emotional by the South Sea, which made me very nervous. I can't imagine how you would deal with the situation if you were disappointed and angry with the whole human race." Sang Sang said, "When human beings need me, they worship me like a god. When they don't need me, they abandon me like grass. If you were in my position, how would you react?" "I don't know. After all, I am not Haotian. I have not experienced the countless years of incense in the human world. Naturally, I can't understand the anger of being betrayed." Ning Kei said, "What I want to tell you is that human beings are not as cold and heartless as you think. You still have countless devout believers in the world." Sang Sang said, "That's because believing in me is good for those human beings." Ning Kei said, "Not all human beings only think from the perspective of interests. We are also affected by many other things. We are not born evil. We always have a kind heart to ourselves and the world we live in. I brought you to the Lank Temple because I want you to see that kindness." Sang Sang said, "What kind of kindness do you want me to see?" Ning Kei said, "Master Qishan is the simplest and cleanest kindness of human beings." Master Qishan was the most respected Vedanta of the Buddhism sect. He used his lifetime cultivation to exchange for the safety of the people in the torrential flood. He once took Lotus in and also wanted to cure Sang Sang. In terms of morality, the master was the most impeccable person. For Ning Kei and Sang Sang back then, he was a kind teacher, whether it was in Buddhism or other aspects. Sang Sang agreed with Ning Kei's view, but she did not agree with him. Qishan is good, but the starting point of his kindness is still the interests of human beings. Whether it is taking Lotus in or using the Buddha's chessboard to help the daughter of Yama escape from the world, it is all the same. Ning Kei said, "Isn't this a great kindness?" Sang Sang looked at the peak quietly and said, "Buddha wants to deliver all living beings from suffering. All Buddhist disciples are diligent in their cultivation. But I am not among all living beings. How can Buddhism save me?" This is a good story. Again, although I may not have written it very well, in my heart, Jiang Yi should be over 80 now. The next chapter will be later, around midnight. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 928. It was also raining in the capital of the kingdom of Qi. The chilly rain drenched the ginkgo trees by the street and the clothes of the passers-by. The ginkgo trees were still a long way from their most beautiful moment. There were not many tourists in the capital, so the streets in the rain were naturally a little lonely. Occasionally, coolies could be seen pulling carts in the rain. Their faces were full of wrinkles and numbness. It was hard to find the vitality of the Tangs. After the murder a few years ago, the lineage of the Dragon Tiger Mountain was lost. The investigation was naturally stopped when Long Qing returned to Haotian Taoism. The West Hill Divine Palace was increasingly respected in the kingdom of Qi. Taoist temples were built everywhere, and the people's faith in Haotian grew. However, it was obvious that the people's lives were getting worse. The Taoist temple of the West Hill Divine Palace was located in the north of the capital. The surface of the temple was painted with white powder and inlaid with countless gems. The eaves and rain paths were painted with gold powder. It looked extremely luxurious and solemn. However, the spring rain today was really heavy. The gems were extremely bright, but the temple itself looked a little cold. The deacons of the temple were unwilling to stand guard outside the temple in the rain. They had already hidden behind the door and were enjoying good wine and food under the cover of the rain so that they would not be seen by the believers. At this moment, the clear sound of hooves could be heard in the rain. A deacon opened the peephole on the door and looked out. He saw a handsome black horse breaking through the rain, dragging a very ordinary carriage behind it. The carriage stopped outside the temple. In the carriage, Ning Kei looked at Sang Sang and said, It's easy to catch a cold in the rain. Let's rest here. We left some medicine here last time. I don't know if it will work. No matter how cold the rain was, how could Hao Yin catch a cold? His words seemed a little absurd. But in fact, Sang Sang's face was a little pale and she looked a little tired. Sang Sang had caught a cold after strolling in the Lank temple in the rain. It was hard to understand. Ning Ke sensed her body and found nothing wrong. The divine power in her body did not decrease, but she had caught a cold. Only humans would catch a cold and die of illness. Sang Sang did not feel particularly uncomfortable. She was not as sick and coughing blood as she did during the journey. She just felt a little dizzy and a little tired. She was not interested in doing anything. Ning Ke did not take it seriously at first. But later he found that even her interest in food had decreased. He then realized that there was a big problem and became nervous. He found Monk Guanhai. Monk Guanhai was also very nervous. He immediately informed the two former eminent monks whom Ning Ke had met in the 3rd Bureau of Hua Mountain. They gathered all the monks in the temple and began to treat Sang Sang. Master Qishan was famous for his medical skills, and the Lank temple had inherited his skills. Naturally, they were many times better than the quacks in the world. Treating Hao Yin was undoubtedly the greatest glory of the Lank temple. Monk Guanhai was helpless. He had no choice but to follow Sang Sang's intuition. He guessed that she had probably caught a cold because the spring rain had soaked her green shirt. Ning Ke found it unbelievable that Hao Yin would catch a cold, but he had no other choice but to decoct the medicine according to the prescription of the monks in the temple, hoping that Sang Sang would recover after one night. After leaving the Lank temple, Sang Sang's health did not improve and she felt tired. After Ning Ke bought a carriage, she felt sleepy sitting in it every day. In fact, apart from being in low spirits, Sang Sang didn't have many other symptoms, and she didn't seem to be in any pain. If others saw her, they would probably think that she was sleepy. However, Ning Ke was very nervous because he knew that she would not feel sleepy in spring, let alone catch a cold. Her tiredness reminded him of that autumn when he brought her to the Lank temple for treatment. This made him very uneasy. Passing through the capital of the kingdom of Qi, Sang Sang became more and more tired. He remembered that he had left some rare herbs in the Taoist temple here, so he decided to rest here for a night. Moreover, he planned to bring Sang Sang here to reminisce about the past and to persuade her. The doors of the Taoist temple were tightly shut in the rain. Some believers who came to seek medical help knelt on the stone steps in front of the temple and kowtowed devoutly. They were all soaked and looked particularly pitiful. Looking at this scene, Ning Ke felt very bad. He did not sympathize with those believers, but he was a little unhappy with the people in the Taoist temple. Logically speaking, no matter how Taoism declined, it had nothing to do with him. But interestingly, he felt that since Hao Yin was his woman, Taoism should be his property. He could cause trouble, but how could those guys cause trouble for themselves? Walking to the front of the temple, he knocked on the door. His knuckles were a little pale. He silently counted in his heart. If no one opened the door after 3 knocks, he would kick the door open. With a creak, the door of the temple opened slowly. A hunchbacked middle-aged man walked out. Without looking up, he asked in a slightly hoarse voice, "What's the matter?" Ning Ke looked at the middle-aged man and felt a little strange. He was wearing a priest's robe that represented his noble status, but he gave people the feeling that he was an extremely inconspicuous odd-job worker. He asked, why didn't anyone receive the believers who came to seek medical help? The middle-aged priest sighed and was about to say something when several extremely arrogant voices came from behind him. What followed the voices was the rich aroma of wine and meat. "You damned cripple, I told you not to open the door. Are you blind? Hurry up and close the door. Do you still think it's like before? Old Qin Siyuan is already dead. Who will protect you now?" Looking down, Ning Ke found that the middle-aged priest's legs were a little inconvenient. He knew who the old Qin Siyuan in the Taoist temple was. Qin Siyuan was a very senior red-robed priest in the Divine Hall of Light. He was pushed out of the Peach Mountain and was in charge of the Taoist temple in the kingdom of Qi. That autumn, Ning Ke and Sang Sang had met him in this temple. Then, in another autumn, Ning Ke and Sang Sang were trapped in Chaiyang City of the Yueluan Kingdom and chased by the whole world. 3 red-robed priests self-destructed with the divine skill of light to help them escape. On the field outside Chaiyang City, a burning carriage appeared. That was the scene of the last old red-robed priest self-destructing with the divine skill. That person was Qin Siyuan. Ning Ke also remembered who this middle-aged priest was. He said, "Lift up your head." The middle-aged priest raised his head and looked at Ning Ke's face. He felt that Ning Ke looked a little familiar. His eyes were a little confused and then suddenly brightened because he recognized who Ning Ke was. and also because tears began to flow out of his eyes. I went out to eat and drink with friends. I'm a little tipsy. This chapter is 2,000 words long. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 929. 2 years ago in Chaoyang City, Qin Siyuan and the other two priests in red exploded themselves to help Ning Ke and Sang Sang escape. During their escape, the priests of the Divine Hall of Light had been secretly helping them. At that time, Sang Sang was the daughter of Yama. It was hard for outsiders to understand what they did. For Haotian Taoism, it was an unbearable betrayal. The West Hill Divine Palace was enraged, especially the hierarch and other bigwigs. They were enraged, so a bloody purge began quietly within Haotian Taoism. In just a few months, countless people had died. What was even more terrifying was that the outside world did not know about it at all. After Qin Siyuan's death, the Taoist temple of the kingdom of Qi fell into the hands of a red-robed divine priest who was favored by the hierarch. The subordinates who were loyal to the old divine priest were severely tortured. As a trusted follower of Qin Siyuan, the middle-aged divine priest was not spared. He offered a large sum of property that he had accumulated for decades to the new red-robed divine priest, and luckily survived. However, he could only do some chores in the Taoist temple. Although he was still a divine priest, he could no longer have the status he had before. He was even lower than an ordinary deacon. Even the guards at the door dared to scold him like a dog. The middle-aged priest thought that this was the end of his life. However, he would rather endure endless humiliation than leave the Taoism temple. Because he wanted to continue looking after it for Qin Siyuan. He wanted to wait for the revival of the Divine Hall of Light. Most importantly, he was waiting for the young couple who had come to ask for medicine. Those who believed in Haotian would be rewarded. This was the clear meaning of the West Hill Divine Palace's scripture. The middle-aged priest finally received his reward. The spring rain was cold and the ground in front of the Taoism temple was wet. Ning Ke listened quietly to the middle-aged priest's narration of the past 2 years and asked, "Where are the others in the Divine Hall of Light?" Through the middle-aged divine priest's answer, Ning Ke knew that in that bloody purge, the Divine Hall of Light, which had been weak for more than 10 years, had suffered a devastating disaster. Those old guys that the Divine Hall of Light had sent to various countries were basically all dead, and it was difficult for them to continue their legacy. The middle-aged priest cried bitterly as he spoke. Ning Ke did not speak. At this moment, Sang Sang's cold voice came from the carriage behind him. "Get in." Last spring, the Divine Hall of Light on Peach Mountain had changed. Many people in Taoism had vaguely guessed the truth, especially the middle-aged divine priest, who was a member of the Divine Hall of Light. He had endured the pressure of the new red-robed priest and the ridicule of the deacons for another year precisely because he had hope. He knew the relationship between Ning Ke and Haotian. When he heard the voice in the carriage, his face suddenly turned extremely pale. His body trembled violently as if he would faint the next moment. But at this moment, how could he fall unconscious? The middle-aged priest bit the tip of his tongue and forced himself to wake up with the pain. Then he pushed the gate of the temple open with all his might. The main door of the Taoist hall was thick and heavy. He seemed to have used all his strength. His teeth were chattering and his joints were cracking. His expression seemed to be crying and laughing at the same time. At this time, the red-robed priest was in charge of the affairs of Taoism in the kingdom of Qi. The deacons and guards in charge of the safety of the gate were naturally his trusted followers. They were drinking and merrymaking behind the gate. Previously, when the middle-aged priest opened the gate a little, those people were extremely annoyed. Now, seeing that he not only did not listen to them but also pushed the gate open completely, they could not help but become even more furious. When the gate was opened, the wind and rain outside fell in. The cold wind blew the dust under the bronze stove everywhere, and the rain diluted the meat soup in the copper pot. How could they not be angry? Are you King crazy? Can't you see that we are boiling meat? If you don't close the gate, I will slap you. Curses kept ringing around the table. If it was any other time, the middle-aged priest would have admitted his mistake and hurried to remedy the situation after being scolded by the trusted followers of the red-robed priest. But today he did not react at all. He held the reins and led the carriage into the Taoist hall. He looked humble, but those people were not in his eyes. Looking at this scene, those deacons and guards were a little surprised. Some of them were so angry that they laughed. Another deacon knocked on the edge of the pot with his chopsticks and simply cursed. Looking at these deacons and guards, Ning Ke could not help but shake his head when he thought of those worshippers outside the Taoist hall in the rain. The deacon knocked the copper pot even more loudly and cursed even more filthy. Ning Kei's hand fell on the hilt of his knife. There was water on the hilt and it was slightly cold. He did not do anything because they were in the Taoist hall. The deacon who cursed suddenly found that something fell into the copper pot in front of him. As the soup boiled, that thing immediately began to emit a strong smell of meat. The deacon was a little surprised. He reached out his chopsticks and swung them in the soup. It was a very tender piece of pig's mouth. Such a big piece of pig's mouth. Why didn't you cut it before putting it into the pot? He habitually complained and scolded, but found that he was only opening his mouth and no sound came out. His companions at the table looked at him with shocked and strange eyes. Those people seemed to have seen a ghost. The deacon was stunned, and then found that the front of his robe was full of blood. He screamed in panic but still could not make a sound. Instead he spat out a lot of blood. Until then he found that his tongue had been cut off. His tongue was rolling in the boiling soup. His face was pale and his expression became muddled. Subconsciously, he held the chopsticks with trembling hands and reached into the soup, trying to fish out the half-cooked tongue. At this time, a straight line of blood appeared on his wrist. His right hand holding the chopsticks was cut off at the wrist, and fell into the boiling soup, splashing a lot of soup. The scalding soup fell on his body, but he did not react at all because he was already stunned. The deacons and guards at the table screamed because of the scalding soup. But their screams only lasted for a very short time because the next moment they also lost their tongues. The main entrance of the Taoist hall suddenly became silent. In the strange and horrible atmosphere, those deacons and guards turned pale in pain, and desperately covered their mouths. The next moment they finally woke up and ran desperately into the hall. Ning Kei did not stop them. It was still quiet in the carriage. The middle-aged divine priest pulled the reins and looked at the backs of those people as if they were dead. He looked extremely indifferent, but deep in his eyes, there was the flame of revenge burning. The alarm in the Taoist hall rang, and the sound of armors and weapons colliding could be heard everywhere. The carriage slowly stopped when it reached the depth of the Taoist hall. Hundreds of divine priests, deacons and fully armed cavalrymen came from all over the Taoist hall, forming a tight encirclement. A red-robed divine official with an arrogant expression walked out from the crowd. He looked at the middle-aged divine priest Ning Kei and the seemingly ordinary carriage, and slowly raised his arms indifferently, with his palms facing the gray sky. I don't care who you are, but this is the divine hall of Haotian. In the name of Haotian, let me send you to the deepest part of the netherworld with the most holy divine light. As soon as he finished speaking, a divine light slowly emerged from the palm of the red-robed divine priest. Ning Kei found that the Haotian divine light was very pure, which surprised him. He thought that the person Xiong Chimo chose to purge the divine hall of light was really capable. Looking at the holy divine light, hundreds of divine priests, deacons and cavalrymen in the Taoist hall showed a look of awe. Even those who covered their mouths with their hands and were covered in blood became excited. But they did not expect what would happen next. The Haotian divine light fell directly on the body of the red-robed divine priest. Everyone was shocked and did not know what happened. Some stupid people thought that it was the new divine skill of the divine priest, until they found that the Lord in the flame was in great pain. The red-robed divine priest struggled desperately in the flame, trying to escape and lie on the ground to put out the fire. But he could not do anything except struggle. The holy flame burned fiercely on his body. His divine robe was instantly burned into ashes, and his skin was cracked, revealing his bloody flesh. It looked extremely miserable. The power of the Haotian divine light was so terrifying that it could melt copper and iron into liquid in an instant, let alone a human body. But somehow the red-robed divine priest did not die immediately. It was even more terrifying because he had to endure the pain brought by the burning. The curtain of the carriage was lifted slightly. Sang Sang glanced at the scene without any expression. The Haotian divine light on the red-robed divine priest suddenly became fiercer, but the speed of the burning became slower. Not only his body but also his Taoist heart. Even the most devout Haotian fanatic could not bear the absolute pain both physically and spiritually, let alone the red-robed divine priest who indulged in worldly pleasures. An extremely miserable howl suddenly rang out from the blazing holy fire. The shrill scream broke through the spring rain above the Taoist hall and the rain clouds above the capital of the kingdom of Qi. Then it fell on the streets and alleys of the capital and countless people. In the capital of the kingdom of Qi, hundreds of thousands of people heard the scream in the spring rain at the same time. The scream was full of infinite pain and regret. It was so clear and deep that people who heard it felt like they were carrying countless sins and knelt down. The The hundreds of divine priests, deacons and cavalrymen in the Taoist hall were even more so. They had already knelt down in the rain, a dense mass of people. Sang Sang looked a little tired. She ignored these people and walked directly into the hall. The people kneeling in the rain looked at her big figure and were extremely frightened. They wanted to attack, but found that their bodies were trembling as if they were about to fall apart. How could they stand up? Suddenly, thunderous hoofbeats sounded in the wind and rain outside the Taoist hall. A commander of the cavalrymen of the Divine Halls of West Hill came to the scene, soaked. Seeing his armor, the people kneeling in the rain recognized his identity. They were slightly refreshed and looked hopeful, thinking that the cavalrymen of the Divine Halls must be chasing after a strong enemy. No matter how powerful that woman was, how could she be a match for the cavalrymen of the Divine Halls? The people in the rain thought so, but they did not realize that what happened today was already beyond their imagination. With a bang, the commander of the cavalrymen of the Divine Halls knelt down with rain splashing everywhere. He looked at Sang Sang's back and touched his forehead heavily on the wet ground, not daring to raise his head. Ning Ke looked at the commander and said, "Finish it. Don't make too much noise." "Yes." The commander answered without hesitation and stood up to draw out his saber from the sheath. Hundreds of cavalrymen of the Divine Halls of West Hill who were on standby in the rain quietly poured into the hall. The people kneeling in the rain finally gave up hope. The story that Sang Sang asked Ning Ke to be the monarch and help the second prince of Wu marry a concubine came from the story of Armstrong. Before I started writing, some readers had already guessed what would happen in the end. Of course, I would not forget to play. My pleasure in writing came from playing with you. It suddenly rained in the Qin kingdom. It was colder than the spring rain. Like Sang Sang, I also caught a cold. I will write 1 chapter today and tomorrow, and 3 chapters the day after tomorrow and the day after that. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 930. It was very quiet in the Taoist hall. Only Ning Ke's footsteps echoed in the corridor. Walking up the stone stairs to the upper floor of the Taoist temple, he looked at the stone window on the side of the corridor facing the street. Light rain drifted in from outside the temple, gently sprinkling on Sang Sang's green clothes and expressionless cheeks. Looking at this scene, Ning Ke's emotions were somewhat complicated. After being washed by the spring rain, she seemed to become much lighter and her breath became much clearer, as if she would leave the world at any time. After seeing the broken stone statue of Buddha in the Lank temple, Sang Sang fell ill. Like a human, she began to feel tired and coughed occasionally. But at the same time she became less and less like a human. To be left behind by the mortal world or to return to the divine kingdom was a problem that the academy wanted to solve. Ning Ke knew that it would be a long and dangerous process, just like a tug of war. Therefore he was a little nervous, but he did not take it seriously. He walked to Sang Sang's side and looked out of the stone window at the capital of the kingdom of Qi in the rain. Neither of them spoke. They stood side by side in silence, as if they wanted to engrave the streets in the spring rain into their eyes. The street was washed clean by the rain. However, after a while, the rainwater on the street was gradually dyed red. Judging from the intensity of the color, it must have been a lot of blood flowing from the Taoist temple. The Taoist temple was still dead silent. The commander of the cavalrymen of the Divine Hall of West Hill and his subordinates executed Ning Ke's request perfectly. They did not make a sound during the massacre. After a while, the main door of the Taoist hall was opened. Ning Ke saw several cavalrymen of the Divine Hall rushing into the spring rain at an extremely fast speed and then galloping away in several directions. These cavalrymen had to rush back to Peach Mountain to report the latest situation to their superiors in the Divine Halls. In addition, they had to inform the cavalrymen of the Divine Halls stationed outside the capital and their leaders. The 2,000 cavalrymen of West Hill Divine Palace followed them all the way. Ning Ke had always been curious about who was in charge. The cavalryman of the Divine Halls of West Hill, who was running toward the street south of the city, suddenly raised the flag in his hand that looked like a blood streamer and shouted loudly, as if he was admonishing the people on the street. Although the spring rain was not violent, it was so far away that the cavalryman's voice became a little muffled. However, Ning Ke's perception was so sharp that he heard the words clearly. Those who disrespect the light will be punished by the heavens. Ning Ke was very clear that the divine retribution was just an excuse. He and Sang Sang had been together for 20 years, and he had never seen her criticize anyone in person. Not to mention the fact that he had to stab someone with a knife. In human history, It was always the West Hill Divine Palace that condemned and killed the alien species on behalf of Haotian or in the name of Haotian. Haotian didn't even know about those things. Sang Sang was a little tired and went to rest. He stood by the stone window and looked at the capital of Qi Kingdom in the rain. He listened to the faint cries and battle cries in the rain without any expression on his face. In the wind and rain, there were faint cries of killing in the distance. Every once in a while, a team of cavalrymen from the divine halls of West Hill would come to the front of the Taoist hall, untie the cloth bags under their saddles, and pour the contents of the bags onto the stone steps in front of the hall. The bags were filled with human heads. A day and a night passed just like that. There were more and more heads on the stone steps in front of the Taoist temple, and the smell of blood became stronger and stronger. The rain could not dilute it at all. In the counties around the capital of Qi Kingdom, there were 180 divine priests, deacons and ordinary Taoists who had participated in the previous bloody purge of Haotian Taoism. All of them were beheaded by the cavalrymen from the divine halls of West Hill. The skulls on the stone steps were piled up like a small mountain. Some of the skulls had their eyes wide open, while others had expressions of regret and fear. Regardless of whether the owners of these skulls were noble red-robed priests or insignificant characters who were forced into the torrent, their faces were all covered in dirty blood. It was impossible to tell the difference between them. Sang Sang woke up and ate a bowl of porridge and 2 beef and radish buns with Ning Kei's help. Then she walked to the stone window and looked at the heads piled up like a small hill in front of the hall with satisfaction. The morning light was so fresh and the painting in front of the hall was so bloody. The holy flame ignited on the pile of heads and quickly became fiercer. The rain could not extinguish the fire, but instead made it burn more fiercely. In the raging fire, one could vaguely see the deformed faces of the heads, as if the dead could still feel the pain. Their faces were twisted with anger and fear. An unpleasant burning smell permeated around the Taoist hall. In the spring rain, thousands of people of Qi were watching the scene in front of them. Their expressions were finally not as numb as usual. They looked a little frightened but more excited to watch the fun. I am Haotian. Sang Sang looked at the pile of heads in the fire and said expressionlessly, humans must obey my will. Ning Kei thought for a while and said, or you can change the word to another way. Sang Sang glanced at him and said, for example? Ning Kei said, although I have no faith, I think there must be an element of love in this. Sang Sang said, humans will never love me. Ning Kei looked at the middle-aged divine priest in front of the hall with tears on his face and said, I brought you to Qi Kingdom to remind you that someone has always loved you, even if it means death. Sang Sang said, that is because I am Haotian. Ning Kei shook his head and said, in order to save you, Chen Xian died, Huayin died, Song Sisi died, and many people in the divine hall of light died. At that time you were not Haotian but the daughter of Yama. Sang Sang said, that is because they believed in Wei Guangming. Ning Kei said, but isn't this kind of belief precious? Sang Sang was silent. Ning Kei said, you said that Master Qishan saved you to save all living beings, but you are not among them, so he did not really love you. Then what about the people in the divine hall of light? What about your teacher Wei Guangming? They only love you. They loved you when they did not know you were Haotian, and they loved you when they knew you were Haotian. They love you unconditionally, so why can't you give them the same love? Sang Sang said, so I should love the world? Ning Kei said, in the first chapter of the West Hill Divine Palace, it is said that God loves the world. Sang Sang said, I don't love it anymore. Ning Kei said, because you are too tired? Sang Sang glanced at him and said, your jokes are often illogical. Ning Kei said, otherwise why wouldn't I love it? Sang Sang said, why should I love the world? Ning Kei thought about it and found that this was indeed a problem. No matter which world it was, all questions were afraid to be asked. For example, the word love that human beings could not forget. Once it was asked, there would be an echo. Yes, why did it have to be love? Why did mothers love their children? Why did women love their men? Why did people love their country? Even if there seemed to be no conditions for love, in the deepest part of it, one could only get an answer that was so cold that it was difficult to breathe. Ning Kei did not know how to answer this question. Just like in the Great River Kingdom, he did not explain love to her clearly. Now he could not explain what love was. At this moment, a divine chariot slowly came from the other end of the long street in the spring rain. The veil around the divine chariot was dark red. After being wet by the rain, it seemed to be dripping blood, which made it look particularly chilling. The divine priest of judgment had once again come to the human world. Ning Kei was not surprised. When he was at the South Sea, He had vaguely guessed who the leader of the cavalrymen of the Divine Halls of Westhill was. This day and night of bloody purge confirmed his guess. There were only a few people in the Divine Halls of Westhill who could make such an important decision in such a short time and implement it. She, who was directly in charge of the cavalrymen of the Divine Halls, was the most likely one. "I don't want to see these people." Sang Sang turned and walked into the room. Her voice sounded a little tired. "Those who disrespected the light in the 3 counties of the Qi Kingdom are all dead." Yi Hongyu said, "The Divine Hall's official decree should be sent to all countries in a few days. The Divine Hall of Judgment has already taken action in advance. I believe it will not take long for the purge to end." Ning Ke looked at her and frowned slightly. He always felt that it was not so simple. Yi Hongyu took off the divine crown and looked at him, saying, "I want to see Hao Yin." The scene at this moment was really like that autumn many years ago. Ning Ke reached out and wanted to take the divine crown from her just like that time. Yi Hongyu did not give it to him. Ning Ke said, "Have you become estranged so soon? Back then you were." Yi Hongyu said, "Don't be glib. I'm not that crazy Mo Shanshan. I don't want to steal a man from Hao Yin." Ning Ke clicked his tongue and said, "Aren't you being glib?" Yi Hongyu brushed off the raindrops on her black hair and said, "Stop talking nonsense and lead the way." Ning Ke said unhappily, "You know that I am Hao Yin's man, but you don't know how to respect me." Yi Hongyu threw the divine crown on the table and said, "How can a man who lives off a woman be respected?" Ning Ke said angrily, "Say that again." Yi Hongyu tied up her wet black hair and said, "You are a man who lives off a woman." Ning Ke suddenly understood how Chen Pipi used to feel. He said angrily, "It is not easy to live off Hao Yin." Yi Hongyu said, "It is not easy to live off a woman." The way they said it was not easy was obviously not emotional. Ning Ke was very embarrassed and could not continue this topic. He said, "She doesn't want to see people from the Divine Hall." Yi Hongyu thought for a while and said, "That's fine. I don't want to kneel to her either." Ning Ke said, "It seems that your faith is not as strong as you said before." Yi Hongyu was silent for a while and suddenly asked, "Which is more important, faith or hatred?" Ning Ke did not understand why she would ask this question. He thought of the revenge in Chang'an and the killing in the Snow Lake. He said, "If it were me, revenge would be more important. Of course, that is because I have no faith to begin with." He looked at Yi Hongyu and said solemnly, "As for what you should choose, I can't give you any specific advice. I only want to say that you should do what makes you happy." Yi Hongyu thought for a while and said, "Is this the principle of starting from the heart?" Ning Ke said, "Yes, instinct and the heart are always the strongest. If the heavens had feelings, the heavens would grow old so they would get sick. I am a mortal and a middle-aged fat man who rarely exercises. There is nothing I can do even if I keep getting sick. Another day of dizziness and I can only write 1 chapter. Actually, I am even more anxious. I want to get better as soon as possible. This month's 200,000 renminbi is still waiting for me on the last day. I wish everyone good health and everything goes smoothly. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 931. They had known each other for many years. They used to be irreconcilable enemies, but they had also fought side by side. The relationship between Ning Ke and Yi Hongyu had always been delicate. Before the right to light, he had gone to the Divine Hall of Judgment to find her. Yi Hongyu had given him a way out, which meant he owed her again. That was why he had answered her seriously. He wanted to help her. Which was more important, faith or hatred? Ning Ke knew that Yi Hongyu was not a believer like him. So there must be a specific reason for her question. But what was it? After Yu and Hao Yin left, the Abbey Dean went up the mountain. Yi Hongyu said, "The hierarch seemed to be subservient, but in fact Taoism was still in a balance. Long Qing had become very powerful and I didn't like many things." Ning Ke said, "So you chose to leave Peach Mountain?" Yi Hongyu said, "I just came to see where you were going to take Hao Yin." Ning Ke asked, "Why do you want to see her?" Yi Hongyu said after a moment of silence, "Or maybe I want to gain some courage through her." Ning Ke seemed to understand something and said, "In fact, you have already started. I want to know what kind of hatred you have with Xiong Chimo." The purge that started last night was a counterattack by the Divine Hall of Light with the help of Hao Yin's power. The Divine Hall of Judgment should not have responded so quickly and resolutely. But if one thought about it, the main force that purged the Divine Hall of Light was the hierarch's trusted followers, then one could understand the reason. The purge would definitely shake the hierarch's foundation. Yi Hongyu did not answer his question but said, I am just carrying out Hao Yin's will. Ning Ke said, you are forcing Hao Yin to give orders to Taoism. Yi Hongyu looked at him and said sarcastically, isn't that what you have been trying to do? Since she did not want to tell him the reason for the hatred, Ning Ke did not ask further. After a moment of silence he asked, even if you succeed, what will you do in the future? Yi Hongyu said, succeed first, then talk about the future. Ning Ke said, what's the point of becoming the new hierarch or the Abbey Dean of the West Hill Divine Palace? Last year in Chang'an he had said something similar to her. The academy has to pay attention to the meaning of everything. But for me, I don't care about this or whether it's meaningful. I only care about whether it's worth doing. Yi Hongyu said, I have my own plans. Where do you want to take Hao Yin? Right now the whole world is guessing where your journey will end. Ning Ke said, I don't have the ability to take her away. In fact, she wants to see the human world herself. She wants to go to these places of our own accord. Yi Hongyu did not know what to say. The current situation had never happened in human history. Even the Abbey Dean had no experience in this and could only watch quietly. Ning Ke said, now I can only take one step at a time and see how far I can go. Yi Hongyu said, it's like crossing the river by groping for stones. Ning Ke recalled the scene when he and Sang Sang crossed the river. He shook his head and said with a smile, we don't need to touch the stones to cross the river. That was the end of the conversation. Yi Hongyu returned to Peach Mountain with 2,000 cavalrymen of the West Hill Divine Palace. Hao Yin would continue to punish Hao Yin Taoism. No one knew when it would truly stop. Ning Ke and Sang Sang left the capital of the Kingdom of Qi and continued their journey to the west. They walked among the green hills in the spring rain and came to the Red Lotus Temple that had been burned into ruins. Looking at the rubble, the weeds, the scorched wood, and the wild mushrooms growing among the wet wood, Ning Ke was silent for a long time. He thought about Yi Hongyu's words and felt a little complicated. Long Qing had led the fallen cavalrymen to besiege him and Sang Sang in the rain in front of this ruined temple. He broke out in desperation and used the practice of Tao Tai to injure Long Qing. Then he broke through the knowing destiny state. Now Long Qing had become even more powerful. Ning Ke knew how proud and confident Yi Hongyu was. Long Qing was a dazzling beauty in the eyes of the world. But in her eyes he was just an ordinary subordinate. There was nothing special about him. Even she had to admit that Long Qing was powerful. This meant that Long Qing was really powerful now. In many people's eyes, Ning Ke and Long Qing were lifelong enemies. In the end, one of them would die and the other would win to end their parallel lives. If Long Qing really became powerful, Ning Ke would be the one who would have a headache. But in fact he was just looking at the ruined temple in the spring rain and felt emotional. Yi Hongyu used the name of Hao Yin to carry out a bloody purge in Hao Yin Taoism and weaken the power of the hierarch. No one dared to oppose her. Now that he was traveling with Hao Yin, why would he worry about the power of the human world? Using Hao Yin to control Hao Yin Taoism would naturally be peaceful. With Hao Yin traveling, the human world would naturally be peaceful. Ning Ke and Sang Sang left the West Hill Divine Palace and went south to the Great River. They went along the coast to the Hua Mountain to visit Lank. Then they went to the Kingdom of Qi and passed by the Red Lotus Temple. After traveling for several months they finally entered the South Jin Kingdom. For Sang Sang this was a war between her and the human world. For Ning Ke this was a means to keep her. For them this was a trip back in autumn a few years ago. For the human world, this journey was endowed with a more complicated and sacred meaning. Countless pairs of eyes were watching and following their footsteps. Many people held their breath and kept quiet because of this. As they walked their mood fluctuated. They forgot to eat and sleep and their minds were in a mess. Naturally they also forgot the disputes between each other. There was a nameless lake in the east of the South Jin Kingdom. Compared to the vast great swamp in the north, it was so shabby that people wanted to cover their faces. Moreover, it was located in the remote mountains and no one lived by the lake. It was extraordinarily quiet. Ning Ke sat by the lake and roasted fish. The bonfire was well controlled. Sang Sang did not need to do anything. His understanding of Hao Yin's divine flame was also useful in cooking. The surface of the fish had been roasted to a golden brown, but the fat and tender flesh was still delicious. Sang Sang took the roasted fish from Ning Ke's hands. She did not eat it expressionlessly as usual, and then expressed her satisfaction with the speed. Instead, she continued to stare at the lake in a daze. The lake was very small and looked pitiful among the mountains. But as long as one sat by the lake, he would definitely be able to see the moon in the lake. It was a full moon today. The round moon hung in the night sky, taking away the brilliance of all the stars and sprinkling countless silver lights on the human world. The eyes of the fish in the lake were illuminated by the light. Sang Sang looked at the moon that gently rose and fell with the lake. Her face was slightly pale and she looked a little tired. Ning Ke had long noticed this phenomenon. Every time the moon in the night sky was full, Sang Sang would become weak, and when the moon was waning or there were clouds, she would become strong again. Of course, this kind of strength or weakness was only relative to her original almost infinite power. Even when she was at her weakest, she was still more powerful than all the cultivators in the human world combined. Although the war between the headmaster of academy and Hao Yen took place in the firmament, the result of the war would eventually fall back to the human world, because Hao Yen was also in the human world. The moon waxed and waned and people were born, grew old, got sick and died. Sang Sang became more and more like a human, so she began to get sick. If this continued, would she die of old age? If Ning Ke could figure out the reason, how could she not? Do you want me to die so badly? Sang Sang looked at the bright moon in the lake and asked Ning Ke beside her. On the balcony of the Divine Hall of Light, she had asked this question in her heart when she saw Ning Ke falling into the abyss at all costs. Now, she asked it in front of Ning Quebec. Ning Ke was silent for a long time and said, "There will be a way." Sang Sang said, "This is an objective question, not a subjective one." Ning Ke did not know how to answer. The lakeside was silent. The night wind blew on the surface of the water, and the bright moon was crushed. Then, as the water gently swayed, the moon slowly gathered again as if nothing had happened. In the depths of Sang Sang's eyes, countless stars were destroyed and reborn. That was her anger. Tens of thousands of stars in the night sky suddenly shone brightly. They were so faint that they could not be seen a moment ago, but in the next moment, they were so dazzling that they instantly covered the light of the bright moon. The human world in the middle of the night suddenly became as bright as day. Especially the small lake in the mountains, it seemed to have become a bright divine kingdom. Countless divine halos fell, and the lake began to boil. Mist filled the air. The fish in the water were frightened and swam around, desperately drilling into the water plants and rocks in the lake. But how could they escape from the power of heaven? A thunder-like roar sounded in the mountains. The lake water gushed up to the night sky like a huge fountain, and the water splashed over the peak behind it. When it fell, it was a warm rain very much like tears. The stars in the sky gradually disappeared, and the lake and mountains gradually quieted down. Hundreds of fish lay in the mud of the lake with their bellies turned over. They were steaming and had been cooked. Ning Ke and Sang Sang were soaked by the lake water, and they looked very embarrassed. The rainwater gathered in the lake again, and it gradually became clear again. Sang Sang's face was stained with some mud, and she looked like a naughty child. Ning Ke carried a basin of lake water and squatted in front of her. He wet the towel and washed her face gently and carefully, wiping off the mud on her face. If heaven had feelings, it was only for a moment. Most of the time, Sang Sang was calm and silent. She was calm because everything was still within her calculations. She was silent because she did not think that any human was qualified to communicate with her spiritually. Ning Ke might be qualified, but she was getting more and more annoyed with him. They walked calmly and silently. They left the wild lake in the mountains and came to the fields with crisscrossed paths. The carriage had already collapsed, and only the big black horse followed them silently. Along the official road, Ning Ke and Sang Sang walked into Linqong, the capital of the South Jin Kingdom. Ning Ke was not unfamiliar with this city. He came to the eastern part of the city and walked into the depths of the slums. The streets were still narrow and the smell was still unpleasant. The temporary buildings built by the families were still so fragile, and the curtains outside the toilets were still so short that one could see the heads. But finally there were changes. There was less sewage in the streets and it became relatively dry. Naturally, the mosquitoes and flies were not as rampant as before. Most importantly, the people walking in it seemed to be more lively. Ning Ke was a little surprised that so many changes had happened in less than a year. He admired the man who preached in the shabby alley even more. Hundreds of people gathered in front of the shabby house, listening to the preaching. The preaching man wore a thin old shirt, and his hair was combed into a bun. There was an old chopstick in the bun and he looked calm and composed. The content of his preaching was from the West Hill scriptures, but the way he explained was very different. Sang Sang looked at that place and suddenly said, "These people should all be burned to death." There is another chapter today. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 932. Compared with the last time Ning Ke saw Yi Su in Lingang, Yi Su looked thinner and paler. But he looked calmer, without any trace of arrogance. There were hundreds of people listening to his sermon, filling up the entire alley. However, no one made a sound and the place was unimaginably quiet. His voice kept ringing in the quiet alley in front of the dilapidated house, mixed with a few painful coughs. The content of his preaching was mainly the West Hill scripture, which was quite different from that of ordinary priests. Ning Ke's eyes fell on the people who were listening to the preaching. Although the clothes of these believers were simple, and many of them had patches on their clothes, they were all very clean. The dozens of people in the southeast were obviously much wealthier in their clothes, but they were also sitting quietly on the white futons like their companions. Through observation he found that Yi Su's preaching was much smoother than expected, which made him even more worried. Because Sang Sang said that these people should be burned to death. He knew that she would do it. Soon after Yi Su started preaching in Lingang, Ning Ke came here. He knew that this was Yi Su's self-redemption, and he wanted to lead the world to realize self-redemption. Haotian Taoism required believers to turn their desires into offerings based on their faith in Haotian, and to place their hopes on the divine kingdom. Yi Su's redemption was to seek help from themselves. For Haotian Taoism this change seemed small, but in fact, it was a shocking revolution because this revolution started from the bottom. It replaced the yearning for the divine kingdom with the love of the world, and asked the believers to save themselves. If all this could be successful, then what position would Haotian Taoism be in? Haotian is watching you. Yi Su stood in front of the dilapidated house and looked at the believers. He said calmly, no matter what you do, no matter what you think, you are under Haotian's watch. So you have to reflect on your behavior all the time, from morning to dusk, from waking up to sleeping. You can go against Haotian's doctrine, but have you done good? Have you restrained evil? Ning Ke couldn't help but look at Sang Sang beside him. Sang Sang was looking at Yi Su. Haotian was looking at him. She didn't say anything, but just listened to his preaching without any expression. Actually, what he said is not completely unreasonable. Ning Ke said, eliminating the intermediate link of the West Hill Divine Palace, and the believers will directly dedicate their love to you. From the perspective of logistics, it can improve efficiency and save costs. Sang Sang said, the divine kingdom belongs to the divine kingdom, and the secular world belongs to the secular world. So, is the Haotian they believe in me or each of them? Ning Ke could not answer this question. Yi Su's preaching was to fundamentally overthrow the doctrine of Haotian Taoism and to separate the specific meaning of the faith into self-awareness. From this point of view, the faith of these believers was not the faith that Haotian needed, because it was very likely that Haotian could no longer absorb their power of faith. While the two of them were talking, today's teachings had already ended. Hundreds of believers left in an orderly manner, leaving a group of children to tidy up the venue and prepare for the afternoon craft class. Yi Su covered his mouth with his hand and coughed twice. When he was about to take down the blackboard hanging in front of the window, he suddenly saw Ning Ke and Sang Sang outside the crowd. His body stiffened involuntarily. The door of the shabby house was pushed open. Ning Ke and Sang Sang walked in and were surprised to see Chin Pippi lying on the bed and Tang Xiaotang cooking by the stove in the corner. Chin Pippi opened his eyes and looked at Ning Ke with a smile. However, his smile froze on his face before he could wave his hand. The spatula in Tang Xiaotang's hand also froze in the air. They had never seen Sang Sang at this time. But since they saw Ning Ke, they naturally knew who the woman beside him was. Yi Su had already lifted the front of his robe and obediently knelt in front of Sang Sang. Sang Sang indifferently looked at everything in the house with her hands behind her back. She did not speak, so Yi Su did not get up and humbly knelt. Sang Sang's eyes fell on him without a trace of warmth. 20 years ago in the wilderness you called Tang an evil demon and Qin Yan an outsider. If you saw you now, what would you call me? Many years ago, she was born in a doctor's mansion in Chang'an. Yi Su said a few words when Ning Ke climbed over the wall with a blood-stained chopper and a black line appeared on the wilderness. Ning Ke's expression was a bit complicated. Yi Su was silent for a long time and said calmly and firmly, today, I am not as stupid as I was yesterday. Yesterday, I will not be as evil as I am today. Sang Sang said, how is blasphemy not evil? Yi Su said, humans are ants and they want to live a better life. Sang Sang said, for countless years, I have never punished or punished anyone. Yi Su said, what do you mean by everlasting night? Sang Sang said, it's just pruning. Yi Su said, every branch and every leaf is a life. Sang Sang said, the Buddha is lying. Yi Su said, the Buddha does not speak. Life is also a life. There was a dead silence in the dilapidated house. Sang Sang and Yi Su's voices kept ringing, and the atmosphere became heavier and more depressing. Tang Xiaotang was holding a spatula in front of the stove, and there was a faint burning smell behind her. As a former world wayfarer of Haotian Taoism, he dared to point out Haotian's wrongdoings and insisted on his own opinion. Yi Su, who had become a cripple, was stronger than most people in the world. Sang Sang asked, "If people want me to save them, why bother to save themselves?" Yi Su said, "Haotian loves people. How can he not allow people to save themselves?" Sang Sang glanced at Ning Ke and said, "Why should I love people?" She had asked Ning Ke this question before, but Ning Ke could not answer. Yi Su, who was much more knowledgeable than Ning Ke, could not answer either. But he could make a rhetorical question. If so, why should people love Haotian? Sang Sang's willowy eyes suddenly became bright and extremely cold. With a sizzling sound, the vegetables in the iron pot behind Tang Xiaotang were finally burnt. Ning Ke clapped his hands and said, "I'm suddenly so hungry. I want to eat." Chin Pippi sat up from the bed and shouted angrily at Tang Xiaotang, "How can you burn a vegetable? Are you going to let me eat? Do you want to starve your husband?" Tang Xiaotang knew what they wanted to do, but she still felt wronged. She waved the spatula and shouted angrily, "I have never cooked in the tribe or in the back of the mountain. Why should I cook?" Ning Ke walked to Sang Sang and asked, "Are you hungry? What do you want to eat?" Chin Pippi rolled up from the bed and helped Yi Su to sit on the edge of the bed. Then he looked at Sang Sang and said, "Seriously, I haven't eaten your cooking for several years. Do you want to show me your cooking today?" Seeing that no one paid attention to her, Tang Xiaotang kept turning the burnt vegetables in the iron pot with the spatula and looked very wronged. In an instant, the room turned from dead silence to extremely noisy. In an instant, the room was filled with the smoke of the human world. In an instant, a table of dishes was ready. Sang Sang was not used to this change and looked a little confused. Before she could figure it out, she was led to the table by Ning Ke and sat down. Tang Xiaotang put a bowl of white rice in her hand. Ning Ke and Chin Pippi looked at each other and saw the lingering fear in each other's eyes. They wiped the cold sweat on their foreheads. Only these two brothers could react so quickly and dare to fool Haotian like this. Sitting at the table, Ning Ke said to Yi Su, "Let me formally introduce you to my wife, Sang Sang." Yi Su also did not come to his senses. He nodded subconsciously and said to Sang Sang, "Just some home-cooked dishes. Feel free to eat. Just treat it as your own home." After saying this, he felt that it was a little strange. Sang Sang did not say anything and quietly looked at the white rice in her hand and the green vegetables on it. The people sitting at the table were worried that she would suddenly wake up. Chin Pippi desperately winked and tried to get Tang Xiaotang to say something. Tang Xiaotang widened her eyes and thought that she was not good at talking. Shouldn't Chin Pippi and Ning Ke be the ones to do this? Chin Pippi kept coughing and thought, "Aren't you her best friend?" Tang Xiaotang looked at the men sitting at the table like clay statues and suddenly felt that something was missing. She asked, "Where is the big black horse? I heard that he also left Peach Mountain. I thought he would follow you." Any topic, as long as someone started it, Ning Ke had the ability to drag it away. He pretended to be surprised and asked, "How do you know what happened in the divine halls of West Hill?" Chin Pippi interrupted at the right time, "We left West Hill with the disciples of the sword Garrett and now live in Linkong City. Lu Yiqing will naturally inform us about what happened in the cultivation world." Tang Xiaotang very timely pulled the topic back again, "Where is the big black horse?" "He is too big. I am afraid that he will bump into people in the alley, so I let him stay in the mountain outside the city." Ning Ke said, "Speaking of which, how have you been these days?" Chin Pippi said helplessly, "I have been listening to senior brother's lectures every day. My ears are calloused." Tang Xiaotang stared at him fiercely. Ning Ke wanted to strangle him. He thought, "Everyone says that you are the most talented guy in Haotian Taoism and the academy. How come you suddenly become a pig brain? We have finally diverted the topic, but you bring it back to Yi Su's preaching. What are you doing?" Chin Pippi also realized that he had said something wrong. He was anxious and secretly glanced at Sang Sang. Sang Sang knew that he was secretly looking at her. She said expressionlessly, "Let's eat." Everyone answered obediently and then began to eat, not daring to speak again. Not talking while eating meant concentration, and concentration naturally led to fast eating. Before long, all the food on the table was cleared. Chin Pippi very irresponsibly hid in the kitchen to wash the dishes, leaving the heavy responsibility to others. Sang Sang stood up and looked at Tang Xiaotang saying, "You?" Tang Xiaotang stood up nervously and said, "What's the matter?" Sang Sang put her hands behind her back and walked out of the room. She said, "Follow me." Tang Xiaotang glanced at everyone and did not know what to do. Ning Ke comforted her, "Don't worry. I have never seen her eat people." "How can you comfort people like that?" Chin Pippi rushed over with a wet rag in his hand and looked at him with grief and indignation. Then he looked at Sang Sang's back and said in a trembling voice, "Come back early if you have nothing else to do. There will be wine and meat tonight. I have something to deal with tomorrow. The update will be late. Have a good weekend." To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for it. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 933. During the winter, the drainage system in the alley was completely renovated. Although it was not as waterproof as the imperial palace of the South Jin Kingdom, the continuous spring rain did not leave many traces here. It proved that under Yi Su's leadership, the hard work of the believers had finally paid off. Sang Sang walked through the street with her hands behind her back. Tang Xiaotang followed her. Her black braids swayed in the spring breeze. Just like her mood, she could not calm down. She and Sang Sang were indeed best friends. But Sang Sang was Hao Yin now, and she was a member of the Devil's Doctrine. It was impossible for their friendship to continue. So why did Sang Sang bring her out? Tang Xiaotang was not used to her once tanned and skinny friend becoming white and chubby. She was also not used to the silence along the way. She gently kicked the stones on the street as if she was bored to death, but in fact she was talking to relieve her tension. Sang Sang suddenly stopped in front of a vegetable shop at the end of the street. She said, "He is a useless man now." Tang Xiaotang was startled. Then she realized who she was talking about. She said, "His ocean of qi and mountain of snow was locked by you. His body is weak and he likes to stay in bed every day. He is indeed a useless man." Sang Sang walked into the vegetable shop and looked at the vegetables on the shelf. She said, "I left Peach Mountain. I think the divine halls must have started to hunt you." Tang Xiaotang said, "Yes. The Qinghe kingdom is very strict. Otherwise we would have returned to Chang'an long ago." Sang Sang stopped and turned to her. She asked, "Then why?" Tang Xiaotang was confused. She asked, "What?" "What?" Sang Sang said, "Everything is destined. Why did you go to Peach Mountain to save him? Why did you accompany him to wander the world? If you are willing to surrender to me, I will grant you immortality." In an inconspicuous vegetable shop in Linggong, amid the smell of all kinds of vegetables and mud, Sang Sang calmly said that she would grant him immortality. Tang Xiaotang was stunned for a long time. She said unnaturally, "It's so sudden. Let's buy the vegetables for tonight first." At this moment, the female shopkeeper recognized her. She greeted her warmly and humbly. When Sang Sang saw some vegetables, she grabbed them and put them in the basket. Sang Sang was a little puzzled. She pointed to the basket and asked, "Why don't we need money to buy vegetables?" These days Tang Xiaotang, Chin Pippi and Yi Su lived together. Usually they would teach some lessons to the children in the streets. To the people living in this area, Yi Su, who lived in a dilapidated house, was no different from a saint. This kind of respect and love naturally fell on her and Chin Pippi. The woman thought that Sang Sang was an ordinary friend of Tang Xiaotang, so she patted her on the shoulder and said with a smile, "What kind of nonsense is that? How much are a few vegetables worth?" Sang Sang noticed that the female vendor had just picked up some vegetable leaves, and there was still some muddy water in them. She couldn't help but frown. Tang Xiaotang hurriedly pulled the female vendor to her side and said a few words to her with a smile. She then looked at Sang Sang and said nervously, "Please don't be angry." Sang Sang said, "I just don't understand why the poorer the people are, the more stingy they are with money." Tang Xiaotang couldn't help but laugh when she thought of how stingy Sang Sang was when she was still a human. Sometimes, when you like something so much, you want to express your kindness by doing this. Sang Sang thought for a moment and said, "Just like the Taoist believers who dedicate their wealth and lives to me?" Tang Xiaotang said, "Almost, but still a little bit different." Sang Sang asked, "What's the difference?" Tang Xiaotang thought for a moment and said, "Like in awe?" Sang Sang suddenly felt a little unhappy. Then she suddenly found that she actually began to care about being liked by others, so she became even more unhappy. The basket was filled with vegetables. Tang Xiaotang wanted to pay, but the female vendor firmly refused. Walking out of the vegetable shop, Sang Sang said, "You haven't answered my previous question." "What?" Tang Xiaotang stretched out her empty hand and held her hand. She looked at her and said sympathetically, "You have been to so many places with Ning Quebec, haven't you figured it out yet?" Sang Sang said, "It's different. If he dies I will die too, so I have to follow him. Tang Xiaotang said with a smile, in fact it's the same. If he dies I don't want to live either. Sang Sang thought for a moment and said, human beings are really stupid. Tang Xiaotang said, in fact sometimes it's quite happy to be stupid. Sang Sang looked at her hand and said, I am very unhappy that you sympathize with me. I'm also unhappy that you touched my body. So I don't understand why I should be happy about being stupid. Tang Xiaotang said with a smile, it's not a good thing for the Academy or the Enlightenment doctrine that you are alive. But I am very happy to see that you are still alive. Maybe this is the happiness brought by stupidity? The two women went to buy vegetables and had a heart-to-heart talk. The three men in the shabby house looked at each other in silence. It was good to know that they were all alive. As for how they survived, it really didn't matter. Chen Pippi looked at Ning Kai and asked worriedly, is she willing to go back to Chang'an with you? Ning Kai shook his head and said, she didn't say, but she is getting closer and closer to Chang'an. Chen Pippi said, does she know what the Academy wants to do? Ning Kai said, the headmaster said that Hao Yin knows everything. Chen Pippi was silent for a moment and said, if so, you have no chance of winning. Ning Kai looked at the blue sky and white clouds outside the window and said, the headmaster also said that there are many things in this world that you will do even if you know it's impossible to do. Chen Pippi said, youngest uncle is such a person and so is the headmaster. You and I may grow into such people in the future, but it won't affect her because she is not a human at all. Ning Kai said, I hope she can make her own choice. Chen Pippi said, no one will make a choice that will destroy themselves. Ning Kai laughed and said, you just said that she is not a human. Chen Pippi said, even so, what will you do? Ning Kai's emotions became a bit complicated. He said, I hope I can find a way by then. The original method seems to be not feasible now. Chen Pippi said, can't we fix the God-stunning array without her? Ning Kai said, whoever started the trouble should untie it. She destroyed the God-stunning array with her footsteps and aura when she lived in Chang'an for years. Now we need her to do it again. Chen Pippi looked at him quietly and said, I only hope you won't regret it by then. If you want to regret, it's better to do it now. When it comes to it, you can't avoid it no matter what. Ning Kai said, I left Chang'an and went to Peach Mountain to pick her up because I was mentally prepared. If I really need to make a choice on that day, it's actually very simple. Chen Pippi heard the hidden determination in his words and sighed without saying anything. Yisu did not say anything. He looked at the streets and the sky outside the window quietly with a clear smile on his thin face. His pale face was washed by the light and looked extremely gentle. He suddenly said, competing with heaven is only calculating oneself. Ning Kai looked at him and asked sincerely, so we don't need to do anything? Yisu turned around and said with a smile, doing your own thing well is more important than anything else. As the saying goes, Hao Yin belongs to Hao Yin, and the human world belongs to the human world. What does it matter? Hao Yin belongs to Hao Yin, and the human world belongs to the human world. That was his Taoism. Ning Kai seemed to understand and asked again, the West Hill Divine Palace will definitely not allow you to continue preaching. Even the Sword Garret can't protect you all the time. What are you going to do next? Yisu said, Linkong City is getting better. I'm going to leave. It was the first time Chen Pippi knew that his senior brother was going to leave Linkong. He was very surprised. Are you going to Chang'an? Ning Kai was also surprised. He thought that since the West Hill Divine Palace would not allow Yisu to continue preaching, only the Tang Empire could provide him with a place to preach after he left the South Jin Kingdom. As I said, the Tang Empire is too good, and the human world is too bad. Yisu said calmly, since I want to experience the suffering of the human world and save it, I naturally have to go to those places where there is real suffering and get to know the people who are suffering. The sunlight passed through the window and fell on him. His thin clothes seemed to be shining. The chopsticks in his bun seemed to be more beautiful than the most expensive ebony. Ning Kai suddenly said, do you still remember the first time we met? Yisu shook his head. Years ago at the foot of Tianqi Mountain in the wilderness, he and Ning Kai met for the first time. At that time he was still a proud Taoist wayfarer. He was the eldest brother and had no impression of Ning Kai at all. I was very impressed by you. Ning Kai looked at him and said, I have never seen a person so lonely. It seemed that his feet were not standing on the ground of the human world, but in another world. He was obviously alive, but it seemed that he had been dead for many years. This is not accurate. I should say that you seemed to be alive and dead in my eyes at that time. I felt sorry for you. Yisu laughed and said, I should be more pitiful now. Ning Ke shook his head and said, "No. Although you are not as powerful as you used to be, and you are pale and weak, almost disabled, you are not pitiful at all. Because you will become a sage." Yisu said, "A sage only appears in 1,000 years. You have gone too far." Ning Ke said, "If you can make everyone a sage, you will naturally be a sage." At this moment, the door of the shabby house was pushed open. Tang Xiaotang carried a vegetable basket and said happily, "Look at how many vegetables Sang Sang and I have brought back. Don't eat leftovers." The dinner was very simple, mainly with green vegetables because there were indeed a lot of green vegetables. In order not to let Hao Yin feel cheated, Chin Pippi went to the butcher's shop to cut a piece of streaky pork and made a bowl of cabbage and meat slices. Then he went next door and took 2 barrels of light wine. Meat and wine were the best to liven things up. Soon the atmosphere in the shabby house became lively. Ning Ke was not a good drinker and was already drunk. With the help of the wine, he pulled paper and ground ink, and wrote half of the epigraph of the shack. "Mountains are not famous because there are immortals. Waters are not deep because there are dragons. This is a shabby house, but only my virtue is fragrant." Sang Sang put her hands behind her back and looked at the calligraphy quietly. She suddenly asked, "Who am I?" Ning Ke said angrily, "Why do you ask me such a philosophical question?" Sang Sang pointed at the word I on the paper. Ning Ke finally understood. He pointed at Yisu and was about to speak, but suddenly realized that since she asked this question, she must have some expectations. So he changed the topic and said, "I am not talking about me." "Then who are you?" "I am you and you are me." "Who do you think I am talking about?" Although Sang Sang knew he was lying, she was still satisfied. Chin Pippi was very dissatisfied and said sadly, "When I first read this sentence, I thought you were still so shameless and arrogant. After listening to your explanation, I found that you have become so depraved." Ning Ke was furious and said, "I don't have guts." "So what?" They said goodbye. Sang Sang naturally could not stand such vulgarity, so she stood in the distance with her hands behind her back. Chin Pippi looked at Ning Ke and said, "Take care." "I will. Just look at her. She is not light but extremely heavy." Ning Ke replied with a smile and walked to Sang Sang. Sang Sang suddenly turned around and looked at Yisu, saying, "You will be burned to death." At this time the twilight was thick, and the afterglow was like blood and fire. Yisu stood in the twilight as if in fire. "I ran back happily and finally made it before midnight." "So good. See you tomorrow." To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 934. In the twilight, Chin Pippi and Tang Xiaotang looked at Yisu uneasily. They did not know what to say. Hao Yin's instructions were like prophecies. God's calculation was never wrong. So who could jump out? Yisu knelt down and bowed to Sang Sang. There was no nervousness on his face, only calmness. Today's meeting was very important for his preaching. Ning Ke and Sang Sang walked away in the twilight. When they were out of Linggong, Ning Ke could not help but say something. He shook his head helplessly and asked, "Can't you say something auspicious?" Sang Sang said, "I'm telling the truth." Ning Ke said angrily, "That's why it's not auspicious." Sang Sang ignored him and walked to the north with her hands behind her back. No one knew what would happen to Yisu in the end. Sang Sang might be omniscient, but she had miscalculated many things and people related to Ning Quebec. Looking back at the city of Linggong under the setting sun, Ning Ke remained silent. The big black horse galloped out of the mountains, neighing joyfully. Someone preached in Linggong without the permission of the divine halls of West Hill. At first, it did not alarm the divine halls of West Hill. It was not until they found out who the preacher was and that the preacher had more and more followers that they became serious, especially when they found that the preaching content was almost blasphemous. Behind the curtain of Hao Yin's divine hall, the hierarch was still tall. But his waving arms and thundering roars showed that he was very angry. Long Qing stood at the stone steps in front of the curtain, looking at the hundreds of divine priests and deacons kneeling in front of him. He looked calm. He knew that the hierarch's anger was not only because Yisu was preaching in Linggong, but also because of the Peach Mountain's seemingly peaceful but actually turbulent situation. The hierarch was now in an awkward and dangerous situation. In the name of Hao Yin, the divine hall of judgment began to carry out a bloody purge within Hao Yin Taoism. In less than 20 days, people from countless Taoist temples in various countries were arrested. The Yu prison was now overcrowded, and most of these people were the trusted followers of the hierarch. The woman on the seat of heavenly black jade had already unsheathed her Taoist sword. No one understood why she suddenly attacked the hierarch, but no one would misjudge the situation. The hierarch was the master of the West Hill Divine Palace and had been in charge of the secular world of Haotian Taoism for decades. Naturally, he had a strong foundation. In the face of the attack from the Divine Hall of Judgment, he should have made a stronger counterattack, or even directly suppressed them. However, this time the hierarch seemed to be helpless. This was because the Abbey Dean had left the Jisho Abbey and came to the Peach Mountain. More importantly, the purge of the Divine Hall of Judgment was the will of Haotian. Hundreds of divine priests and deacons received the order and left. The Divine Hall of Haotian gradually became quiet. As for how these people would break through the blockade of the Sword Garret of South Jin Kingdom and enter Lingang, that was something they had to consider. If they dared to express their doubts now, they would face the wrath of the hierarch. Long Qing bowed to the hierarch behind the light screen and left the Haotian Divine Hall. He walked silently on the cliff platform and walked into the dark Divine Hall of Judgment. Then he entered the U prison through the tunnel skillfully. The Divine Hall of Judgment and the U prison were heavily guarded, especially when Haotian Taoism was in turmoil. Everyone knew that the great Divine Priest of Judgment was making things difficult for the hierarch. Even people from the Divine Hall of Haotian could not enter. But Long Qing was an exception. It was not only because he was now the successor of the Jisho Abbey, but also because he had lived in this Divine Hall for a long time. He used to be the priest of the judicial department and had countless loyal subordinates. Now that Yi Hongyu was carrying out the purge, who would dare to stop him? The U prison was still as quiet as before. No sound could be heard from the cells on both sides of the dry tunnel. The divine priests and Taoists who had been captured and brought back to the Peach Mountain were already dying after being tortured by the judicial department. They could not even cry out in pain. They could only lie on dry straws and wait for death in despair. Although it was quiet, in fact, the U prison had not been so lively for a long time. Now, in the belly of Peach Mountain, hundreds of divine priests, Taoists, and deacons who had been escorted back from various countries by the judicial department were imprisoned. The dim light mixed with the smell of blood, making the atmosphere very depressing. Long Qing walked on the quiet mountain path with a calm expression. He did not feel depressed at all. Looking at the swaying light in front of him and smelling the smell of blood, he felt his heart begin to beat faster because of excitement. He wore an ordinary Taoist robe. There was a hole in his chest under the robe. His heart was beating in the hole. The surface of the Taoist robe rose and fell with it. The light was swaying like the light waves on the South Sea. Long Qing pushed open the gate of a cell and walked to the bed. He looked at the old man covered in blood on the grass and said calmly, "Long time no see, Divine Priest Chu." Chu Fengqi was the chief red-robed great divine priest of the West Hill Divine Palace stationed in the Song Kingdom. He was the most loyal subordinate of the hierarch and had a very high status in Haotian Taoism. In the purge of the remnants of the Divine Hall of Light years ago, he was the most ruthless one. So now he became the most important target of the Divine Hall of Judgment. The Divine Sedan of Judgment went to the Song Kingdom in person. Yi Hongyu directly cut off Chu Fengqi's arms in the Taoist Hall and was dragged back to the Peach Mountain by the cavalrymen of the Divine Hall. He became a dead dog now, but the hierarch could do nothing about it. Chu Fengqi did not know how cruel the torture he had endured these days. But he did not see the hierarch coming to save him. He had long been disheartened and could only wait for the day of death. However, someone came to see him today. Chu Fengqi opened his eyes with difficulty and looked to the side of the bed. He found that it was a young Taoist who came to see him. The Taoist had several very sad scars on his face. He was the chief red-robed great divine priest of the Song Kingdom. How could he not know Long Qing? Prince Long Qing? Chu Fengqi was a little shocked and puzzled. Then he suddenly brightened because he thought of the relationship between Long Qing and Yi Hongyu. He also thought of Long Qing's current status in Haotian Taoism. Now even the hierarch lord chose to abandon him. If there was anyone else who could save him, it would be Long Qing and the Abbey Dean behind him. Chu Fengqi, who was already desperate, suddenly saw hope. He suddenly became spirited and his eyes were full of hope and begging. He hurriedly said, "Chu Fengqi is willing to dedicate his life and soul to the Abbey Dean and the prince. If I can return to the Song Kingdom, the Song Kingdom's Taoist temples and wealth will all be at the prince's disposal." In his opinion, Long Qing must have the intention to save and use him. But now, he had nothing else that could move him except the Song Kingdom's countless Taoist temples and his private wealth. Long Qing looked at him quietly and said, "Look at me." Chu Fengqi was a little puzzled and looked at his eyes. Long Qing's eyes were very normal, black and white. But when he looked at them, a strange change happened. The dividing line between the black pupil and the white pupil disappeared for some reason. The worlds on both sides of the line began to touch and then melt. The black pupil faded, the white pupil turned black, and the black and white mixed together. It was the gray of the beginning of chaos. Within a breath, Long Qing's eyes turned completely gray. Looking at the gray eyes, Chu Fengqi suddenly felt very scared and his body became extremely cold. He subconsciously wanted to turn his head and look away, but found that he could no longer control his body. Chu Fengqi's cheeks suddenly became thin, and the blood on his body gradually faded. He tried to make a sound but could not speak. He wanted to push Long Qing away, but his arms had already been cut off by Yi Hongyu. He could only feel everything in his body flowing out in despair. Indeed, nothing was left out. Chu Fengqi's life, spirit, cultivation state, and psyche were all taken away by Long Qing's gray eyes. In an instant, Chu Fengqi stopped breathing. Long Qing slowly closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, his gray eyes had become black and white again. There was nothing special about them. No one knew that there was now another person in his body. His sea of consciousness had gained an extremely rich sense of perception and some brand new knowledge. He had become slightly stronger. On the haystack, Chu Fengqi's body was curled up and looked very miserable. He did not understand that what moved Long Qing was not the hidden wealth in the kingdom of Song, but himself. Long Qing walked out of the cell calmly and came to the next cell. He pushed the door open and entered. Looking at the man on the bed, he said calmly, "Divine Priest Mu, long time no see." After a while, Long Qing walked out of the cell and went to the next cell. The quiet and terrifying process kept repeating. He had absorbed the cultivation of countless grassland powerhouses in the left king's palace of the East Wilderness, and his gray eyes had reached the advanced level. He did not stop until the early morning. The morning light came in through the stone window of the cell and fell on Long Qing's face. His expression was very calm and his eyes were black and white. He looked like a young man with no distracting thoughts and a clear mind. The scars on his face were still there, and they did not fade because of the increase in his cultivation level. Instead, they became deeper, making him look very terrifying. He looked like the demonic gods in the murals in the divine temples. Long Qing looked at the morning light outside the window and sighed softly. Then he turned around and walked out of the U prison. When a powerhouse walked, he would take long breaths. As he breathed, the pink and wet heart and lungs in the hole in his chest kept pressing against each other, which looked very disgusting. However, in this dirty world of rotten flesh, there was a peach blossom looming and was about to bloom. The peach blossom was pure black for a while and then golden for a while. No matter which color it was so holy. Long Qing walked out of the divine hall of judgment and came to the cliff yard. He walked to the inconspicuous stone houses by the cliff. Years ago in the wilderness, Yi Hongyu forcefully lowered her state in order to break the binding of Lotus. She was almost disabled and was treated coldly and humiliated by the divine halls of West Hill. That was why she chose to live in this stone house. Long Qing went to the stone house not to reminisce about the past, nor to prove how powerful he was to the woman who was not on the Peach Mountain. He went there because it was the Abbey Dean's residence on the Peach Mountain. The Abbey Dean was the real leader of Taoism. Especially when the hierarch did not dare to resist and chose to kneel in front of him, he should live in the highest divine hall of Haotian on the Peach Mountain. For some reason, the Abbey Dean did not sit in the divine hall of Haotian. Instead, he lived in the inconspicuous stone house by the cliff. He also did not interfere in the affairs of the divine halls of West Hill. Long Qing did not understand what the Abbey Dean was thinking. Since it was proven that the hierarch had a high state but a weak Taoist heart, why did the Abbey Dean not just remove him from the position of hierarch? In the secular world, the hierarch was still powerful. But on the Peach Mountain, the Abbey Dean had the absolute loyalty of Zhao Nanhai and the others from the South Sea. Together with those elders, Ning Ke and Ning Ke, they could easily expel the hierarch from the divine hall of Haotian. He stood in front of the stone house and thought for a while. He still could not figure it out. He shook his head and pushed open the old wooden door. With a shrill squeak, he walked into the dark world. It was very dim in the stone house. If one did not look carefully, he could not even see the face of the Abbey Dean in the wheelchair. As for the middle-aged priest behind the wheelchair, he seemed to be one with the darkness. The Abbey Dean coughed slightly and was about to drink some water. The middle-aged priest's hand was always on the back of the wheelchair. Long Qing quickly stepped forward and picked up the kettle from the stone table. He filled a bowl with water and handed it to the Abbey Dean respectfully. The Abbey Dean seemed to be more energetic after drinking the water. He looked at Ning Kai and asked, "Are you confused?" Long Qing did not dare to hide it. He told him all his questions. The Abbey Dean did not explain in detail. He said calmly, "The great divine priest of judgment is doing what you want to do. So why are you so anxious?" Long Qing understood. But he still did not understand why Yi Hongyu would launch such a strong attack on the hierarch. Now it seemed that the Abbey Dean had already known the hidden reason. The Abbey Dean suddenly asked, "What do you think of Yi Su?" Long Qing thought about it carefully and said, "My senior brother is very talented." The Abbey Dean nodded slowly and said, "Yes. Your senior brother does have a rare talent in Taoism. I used to think that his talent was inferior to Pippi. Now I think I was wrong." Long Qing thought that his senior brother had become a useless man. The Abbey Dean must not be referring to his cultivation state. He must be talking about his recent preaching in Lingang City. The hierarch is very angry. He has sent people to Lingang City to investigate. He said, "But in my opinion, my senior brother has only been preaching for a short time. Most of his followers are stupid and stubborn. There is no need to worry." The Abbey Dean looked at the thin booklet in his hand and said, "I wanted to sharpen your senior brother into the sharpest sword in Haotian Taoism. Unfortunately, his sword was destroyed by Jun Mo before the Verdant Canyon. I didn't expect that he would enter another realm because of this and might even achieve something beyond my imagination." The thin booklet was copied by someone sent by the Divine Halls of West Hill to Lingang City. It recorded all the content of Yi Su's preaching. The sentences were simple and the principles were simple. But even the Abbey Dean was shaken. This chapter has 4,000 words. There are more copies today. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 935. It was very quiet in the stone house. Long Qing looked at the booklet in the Abbey Dean's hand and wanted to say something. But the words that came out of his mouth were far from what he wanted to say. The Verdant Canyon is not open. It is difficult for the Tangs to go south. The Qinghe River is in the north. The South Jin Kingdom is isolated. Liu Bai is no longer in the Sword Garret. No one can protect Lingang. If you want, I can kill them anytime. There is no hurry. Let's wait until the important matter is settled. The Abbey Dean said, "We have an honored guest today. Stand aside and don't miss any enlightenment." Long Qing was a little shocked. Now that the headmaster of the academy had left the human world, Liu Bai was dead, and the chief monk of scripture never left the Shenkong temple. Who else in the world could be called an honored guest by the Abbey Dean? At this moment, someone knocked on the door of the stone house. The sound was very messy and without any rhythm. It seemed that the person had not been a guest for a long time or was drunk. Long Qing opened the door with a harsh squeak. A breeze blew in his face with the intoxicating smell of wine and a middle-aged man in an ordinary robe. The middle-aged man looked very ordinary. He had wrinkles but did not look old. He had silver hair but did not look old. His skin was more delicate than a young girl's and his black hair was darker than a newborn's. It was impossible to tell his age. Or rather, it was a man without age. Long Qing was slightly stunned. Suddenly he thought of something. His pupils shrank and the peach blossom in his chest began to bloom. He was ready to fight with all his might. This man was not from the Divine Halls of West Hill. He could enter the Peach Mountain and come to the Cliff Plateau without any reaction from the powerhouses of the Divine Halls. Could only mean one thing. This man was in the limitless state. The next moment, Long Qing's eyes suddenly calmed down. The raging psyche power all went back to his sense of perception. The peach blossom in his chest slowly fell down and retracted its petals. Because the middle-aged man took off the flagon on his belt and began to drink. He drank very boldly like a tornado on the sea. He did not put down the flagon but the wine kept pouring out. This man was in the limitless state. The limitless state and the limitless state were the great divine powers of cultivation above the 5 states. Long Qing finally met the Abbey Dean who could do both in the past 1,000 years. In the face of such a powerful figure, Long Qing knew that there was no point in risking his life, so he calmed down. At the same time, he guessed that this was the distinguished guest that his teacher had mentioned. "Senior, please." The drunkard walked into the stone house with a flagon in one hand and the other behind his back. He looked up at the layout of the stone house and mocked, "I haven't been to the West Hill for a long time. I didn't expect Taoism to be so weak." His voice was still as old as before, like old bricks rubbing against each other. It was so ear-piercing that it seemed to pierce right into everyone's heart. Long Qing's face became a little pale. He felt that his ocean of qi and mountain of snow was showing signs of instability and collapse because of the other party's words. He forced himself to take a deep breath and finally stabilized his Taoist heart and ocean of qi and mountain of snow with great difficulty with the help of the extremely overbearing psyche power. The drunkard turned around and looked at him. He was surprised that the young Taoist could calm down on his own. He said, "I take back what I said. The young Taoists are stronger than I thought." The Abbey Dean was now a cripple, but he did not seem to be affected by the drunkard's voice. He looked at Long Qing and said with a smile, "Yes, he has made great progress these years." The drunkard looked at the middle-aged Taoist behind the wheelchair and said, "You are even better." The middle-aged Taoist smiled and said, "Thank you." This middle-aged Taoist was very ordinary, so ordinary that he was easily forgotten and covered by the darkness. He had no reputation in Haotian Taoism or the world. Even the hierarch in Long Qing only knew that he was the Abbey Dean's junior brother and a cultivator in the knowing destiny state, but they did not even know his name. He seemed to be a nameless person. However, in the past decades, the Abbey Dean was forced to the South Sea by the headmaster and did not dare to set foot on land. In fact, he was in charge of all the affairs of the Jisho Abbey and even Taoism. How could a person who could do so many things quietly and peacefully be ordinary? Ordinary people could not tell, but the drunkard was able to tell that he was not ordinary. The middle-aged Taoist did not care about fame. But as a cultivator he could never be truly peaceful. Therefore he was very satisfied with the drunkard's evaluation. "Of course you are the best." The drunkard looked at the Abbey Dean in the wheelchair and said, "I have to admit that if you were in your best condition, even the butcher and I together would not be able to defeat you." The Abbey Dean smiled and said, "It's all in the past." The drunkard changed the topic and said, "So I don't understand. You are already a useless person. Why do you still dare to invite me here? Aren't you afraid that I will kill you?" He had praised Long Qing and the middle-aged Taoist hiding in the darkness. But it was just a compliment. If he wanted to, he could still kill the 3 people in the stone house. If I am not wrong, Haotian should have gone to the small town to find you too. That is why you appeared outside Chang'an. Taoism has a chance to breathe thanks to you. The Abbey Dean looked at him and said with a smile, "So, why do you want to kill me?" The meaning of this sentence was clear. "Since we are both working for Haotian, why do you want to kill me?" The drunkard stared into his eyes and said, "If you were not a useless person, you might be qualified to be mentioned in the same breath as me. But now you are just a bunch of ants. Haotian will not care if I kill you." The Abbey Dean said calmly, "If the divine kingdom cannot be reopened, you will also be an ant." The drunkard's expression changed slightly. He did not expect this half-useless person to know such a secret. He said coldly, "You ants can't do anything about the heavenly dome." The Abbey Dean said, "I heard that when the chief monk preached, there were countless flying ants bathing in the light. Although they did not fly to the heavenly dome, they burned into countless flames like the gate to the nirvana." The chief monk in this sentence was naturally the chief monk of scripture of the Shenkong temple. The drunkard understood what he meant. He frowned and said, "You are so arrogant. I wonder why Haotian thinks you are pious." The Abbey Dean said, "Haotian's view of the world will not be affected by the behavior of the world." The drunkard said, "I am not Haotian. I will be affected. I want to kill you even more now." The Abbey Dean asked, "Why do you want to kill me?" The drunkard said, "Because your arrogance frightens me. Besides, I do not need a reason to kill." The Abbey Dean said calmly, "You don't have to pretend to be arrogant. Because it does not work on me. I know you are not Kaharan or Lu Bai. You are just a man who loves to drink." The drunkard looked slightly serious and said, "In your eyes, what kind of person am I? Gluttony for wine is the desire to indulge, gluttony for meat is the desire of the tongue. What the two of you cultivate is desire. Human desire is so strong, so indestructible, that you can endure the endless night. But it is also because you cultivate desire that you are so cowardly. The desire to live is too strong, so naturally you are afraid of death." The Abbey Dean looked at him and said with a smile, "You said you have not been to the West Hill for a long time. I know it is a lie. Because you have never stepped into the West Hill divine kingdom. Because you dare not. You are afraid of being seen by Haotian." The drunkard's expression became serious. The Abbey Dean continued, "According to the doctrine of Haotian Taoism, human's desire is the original sin. You and the butcher are even more sinful. But since Haotian has agreed to cleanse you of your sins, I think you should not be as timid as you have been for countless years." The drunkard said coldly, "But what you are going to do is against her will." The Abbey Dean shook his head and said, "You are wrong." The drunkard asked, "What is wrong?" "Let's talk about desire." Together with the cause and effect mentioned by Buddhism, we can see the truth of most things. We can see what everyone wants. What Xiong Chumo wants is glory and fame in the secular world. For that, he doesn't care about anything else. What he wants is power. He glanced at Long Qing and then at the drunkard and said, "You and the butcher want eternal life. But Hao Yin wants to go back to the divine kingdom. Maybe she will forget about it. As her followers, we have to remind her about it. If she really can't remember it, we have to find a way to send her back." The drunkard said, "So it is not against her will?" The Abbey Dean said, "Correct." The drunkard was silent for a long time. He looked at the Abbey Dean and sighed, "I have never met someone as strange as you. Forgive me for not being able to keep you company." The Abbey Dean said calmly, "You have to." The drunkard said sarcastically, "For countless years, Taoism has never dared to mess with me. Has it changed now?" The Abbey Dean asked, "What about Hao Yin?" The drunkard said, "If she told me herself, it would be one thing. But it is another if you guess her thoughts. Besides, your thoughts may go against her will." The Abbey Dean said, "You can have a look first and then bring a message for me." The drunkard frowned slightly and asked, "To whom?" The Abbey Dean said slowly, "The journey to the west is long. I can't move around now. I have to trouble you." The drunkard finally confirmed his thoughts. He said with a changed expression, "You are too bold. There is no hope. Even though she is much weaker now, she is still Hao Yin. How many people have gone against heaven's will in the past? Even the headmaster of the academy was defeated by her, not to mention you and me." "You are wrong. This is not going against heaven's will." "It is," the Abbey Dean said calmly, "enforcing justice on behalf of heaven. Preaching to heaven. If heaven does not speak, what should we do? If heaven does not agree, what should we do? If heaven does not agree, what should we do? Float on the sea?" These were not the Abbey Dean's choices. His choice was very firm. "Since heaven does not agree, then I will enforce justice on behalf of heaven. As long as I follow the heaven's way, then heaven cannot say I am wrong." There is more today. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 936. The drunkard looked at the Abbey Dean as if he was an idiot and said in a trembling voice, "You are crazy." The Abbey Dean smiled and said, "No, I have never been so sober." The drunkard frowned and said, if she can't go back to Hao Yin's divine kingdom, and you choose to uphold justice for her, what will happen to the world?" The door of the stone house was not closed. The Abbey Dean looked at the clear sky outside the cliff plateau and said, "The world will still be the same, because everyone including you seems to have forgotten one thing." The drunkard asked seriously, "What is it?" The Abbey Dean raised his right hand and pointed at the sky. "Hao Yin is in the human world, but Hao Yin is also in the sky." The drunkard understood and kept silent. "I know you will eventually agree." The Abbey Dean looked at him and said calmly, "If she stays in the human world, how can you achieve immortality?" The drunkard asked confusedly, "You said that everything in the world depends on what everyone wants." "I want immortality. What about you? What exactly do you want?" "I want immortality," the Abbey Dean said. The drunkard savored the two words and felt the infinite desire. The Abbey Dean said again, "Immortality is the only way to achieve immortality. Any change will eventually lead to the end." This was the fundamental conflict between the Academy and Taoism. The drunkard knew it very well. He frowned and said, "Even if it is a pool of stagnant water?" The Abbey Dean said, "You and I live here. Countless ancestors and descendants will live here. There are green trees and blooming peach blossoms. Who can say it is a pool of stagnant water?" The drunkard said, "I don't think this will convince the headmaster." The Abbey Dean said, "Even if it is a pool of stagnant water, it is still eternal." The drunkard said, "I want immortality because I want to live. Is immortality really so important?" The Abbey Dean said after a long silence, "I have been thinking about this since I realized Taoism. I found that I can't accept a world without immortality." It was quiet in the stone house. Only his voice kept echoing, as if he was trying to wake up every bird in the Peach Mountain and every flower in the Divine Hall. If everything is going to end, then what is the meaning of everything that has existed in time? Every time I think of this possibility, I feel incomparable despair. Don't you feel despair as well? The Abbey Dean looked at the drunkard and asked seriously, At the same time he was also asking his younger brother and Long Qing in the room. He was also asking everyone in the world, including the headmaster and those in the academy. The drunkard felt a little bitter. He did not know how to answer the question because when he thought about it carefully, he found that there was a great horror hidden in it. The horror was so great that he did not dare to think further. He asked, "What about yourself? If you can't be eternal with heaven and earth?" The Abbey Dean said, "Everyone is a part of heaven and earth. As long as heaven and earth are immortal, so will we." The drunkard asked, "Even without your own subjective consciousness?" The Abbey Dean said, "It must be gratifying to know the immortal." The drunkard shook his head and said, "Your thoughts have deviated from the original meaning of life." The Abbey Dean smiled and said, "Isn't this the purpose of our cultivation? Life is a cultivation." Ninkei had forgotten where this saying came from. But because he always felt that this saying was too pretentious to the point of being noble and elegant, he never forgot it. As Sang Sang traveled the world, she crossed great rivers and mountains and met many strangers and old friends. He suddenly realized that this saying was very reasonable. Then he realized that he had mixed up the two sayings, life is a journey and life is a cultivation. The scenery on the journey kept changing, so did his mood. After leaving Linggong, bypassing the Great Swamp and entering the Tang Empire along the south of Yen, Ning Kei was in a very good mood. He was finally home. The green fields were so beautiful, and the smell of manure in the wind was not so pungent. People behaved differently when they were in a good mood. Ning Kei's habit was to do the same simple thing over and over again, as if that was the only way to express the joy in his heart. For example, he would write on the ground with a branch, or grind on the whetstone with a hatchet, or hum parts of a song over and over again. He rode on the big black horse and held Sang Sang in his arms. Although it was difficult for him to hold her tightly because of her figure, it did not affect his mood. "Hey Jude, la 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 la." He only remembered the first line of this song from his previous life. He repeated it for another reason other than joy. The more he sang, the happier he became. Even his eyebrows flew up as if he was dancing. Sang Sang did not have any reaction at first, but as she listened to him singing this song, her face became more and more gloomy, as if her cheeks were wet with dew. This situation lasted for a long time. No matter how slow Ning Kei was, he finally noticed her displeasure. He moved forward and looked into her eyes. He asked confusedly, "What's wrong?" Sang Sang said, "I don't like being called a black pig." Ning Kei then realized it. He held back his urge to laugh and said, "You are so white now. How could they be talking about you? Don't be so sensitive, okay?" Sang Sang said, "I'm not happy because you are still thinking about the black in the past." The misunderstanding because of the song was after all just a small episode in the journey. The two rode on the big black horse all the way to the east. They saw wild rape flowers and colorful farmhouses. Finally they arrived at Chang'an. The majestic city rose into the clouds and was unparalleled. Many years ago, when they returned from the city of Wei to the south and saw the majestic city, they had a lot of emotions. But now they were very calm because they had lived here for a long time. Ning Kei was actually a little excited because he had brought Hao Yin home. "I didn't say we were going to the city." Sang Sang's words were like a basin of ice water, drenching his heart. He thought about it and said, "I really have no reason to ask you to go to the city." Hao Yin had come to the human world. If there was anything that could threaten her safety, it would be the God-stunning array in Chang'an. Even if it was incomplete, it still made her vigilant. They came to the pavilion beside the state highway and looked at the majestic city in the distance. He was silent for a long time and then asked, "If this is not the end of this journey, where is it?" Sang Sang said, "If this is the end of your journey, then you can leave." Ning Kei was silent. It was not until they returned to Chang and that he realized the war between Hao Yin and the human world was far from over. The journey would continue. He could threaten her with suicide and ask her to go to Chang'an with him. But he did not want to do that because it was meaningless and it did not mean victory. The day when Sang Sang was willing to go to Chang'an was the day of victory. The pavilion was 10 miles away from the city. Ning Kei looked at 10 miles away and seemed to be able to see the old black brick city wall. Then he saw the city gate slowly open and a scholar holding the hand of a youth walked out. It was eldest brother who was still wearing a cotton-padded jacket in the warm spring day. The academy protected the country. The youth held by eldest brother was naturally the current emperor of the Tang Empire. The young emperor was handsome and his eyes were very straight. But at this moment he was a little confused. "Teacher, why did we leave the palace and come here?" Eldest brother said gently, "I brought you to see two people. The young emperor looked into the distance on the state highway and did not see anyone. He knew that Chang'an had been under martial law since 10 days ago. Since last night, the city gate had been closed and no one was allowed to enter or leave. Teacher, who are we going to see? Does it have anything to do with the tense atmosphere in the palace? Are they the enemies? Enemies of Haotian Taoism or the national master of the Golden Palace? The eldest senior brother smiled and said, they are two very interesting people. The woman is learning how to become a human or learning how to refuse to become a human, while the man is doing something more difficult. He wants to make her like being a human and teach her how to become one. Thinking of the rumors in the palace, the young emperor vaguely understood and became nervous. He subconsciously clenched his teacher's hand and said, youngest uncle is back. Eldest brother said, yes, your youngest uncle is back. Your father and mother have entrusted Chang'an and the country to him, and he has never disappointed anyone. He has temporarily put his life and the things that he cherishes more than his life behind him and is working hard. The young emperor withdrew his hand and solemnly bowed to the distance. Eldest brother looked at the pavilion and thought, youngest brother, I brought His Majesty here for you to see. Chang'an is just like yesterday. Don't worry about him. Just do your best and don't force yourself. He held the young emperor's hand and walked back into the city. The city gate was not closed. Dozens of green-skinned men in cyan clothes and pants pulled a black carriage out of the gate with very strong ropes. It seemed to be very difficult. After a long time, the black carriage was dragged to the pavilion. Mr. Qi and dozens of brothers of the Fish Dragon gang knelt down and kowtowed to Sang Sang. Then they looked at Ning Ke with a smile and turned to Chang'an. Zheng Jing, the Grand Secretary, and his wife were also among the crowd. Mrs. Zheng walked to the pavilion and looked at Sang Sang's back. She had mixed feelings and could not connect this tall woman with her daughter. Ning Ke said to Sang Sang, you have to return some of the worldly karma. Sang Sang turned to Mrs. Zheng and said expressionlessly, I grant you immortality. Ning Ke felt helpless and thought, what do you think immortality is? Cabbages? Mrs. Zheng did not hear clearly what she said. Hearing the familiar voice, her heart trembled and she subconsciously took 2 steps forward. She felt that Sang Sang's aura was so familiar. Without hesitation, she grabbed Sang Sang's sleeves and held her tightly in her arms. She cried in a trembling voice, my son, what's wrong with you? Sang Sang frowned and was a little unhappy. Ning Ke looked at her and thought, if you came to the human world for cultivation, then the hugging and crying in the Spring Breeze Pavilion is an experience that you can't avoid. Sang Sang knew what he was thinking. It was not that she guessed or calculated, but she really knew what he was thinking. She heard his voice and then she quieted down. She quietly let Mrs. Zheng hug her and let her hot tears wet her flowery cyan clothes. Her face was expressionless and no one knew if she had realized something. 3 chapters with 10,000 words. Is this a small weekend surprise? There will be more surprises in the future. Please look forward to it. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 937. Since they were leaving the pavilion, there was bound to be a farewell. Zheng Jing comforted his wife in his arms. His wife turned around from time to time and looked at Sang Sang in the pavilion with teary eyes. Sang Sang was still expressionless. She looked down at the tears left by Zheng Jing's wife on her clothes. The tears quickly disappeared and no trace could be found. Ning Ke looked at the magnificent city in the distance and thought, how can there be a perfect way to live up to both Chang'an and Qin? On a threshing ground in a village dozens of miles south of the city, the drunkard slowly put down his flagon and looked somewhere with mixed emotions. He was sad and confused. On the cliff plateau of Peach Mountain countless miles south of the city, the Abbey Dean sat in a wheelchair and looked at the blue sky outside the stone window. He sighed with emotion and said, it seems that Haotian really needs our help. Long Qing asked, what do we need to do? The Abbey Dean said, Haotian knows very well what we should do. What we need to do is to prepare her for the future and welcome her arrival. The city gate of Chang'an was closed and there was no one around. It looked very lonely, but no one knew that at this moment, countless eyes were looking at the farewell pavilion in the south of the city. Sang Sang knew that many people were looking at her and waiting for her decision. But she did not care. She was Haotian and no matter what she did not need to explain to human beings. The big black horse pulled the heavy black carriage consciously. Ning Ke walked into the carriage and found that the academy had prepared everything he needed. He took out something from a secret compartment and inserted it into the intersection of the talisman lines on the carriage wall. As a very faint light appeared, the talisman array on the wall of the carriage was instantly activated. The carriage made of iron and steel turned into a hair on the dust. When Sang Sang walked into the carriage, he was packing his luggage, the black arrow case, the black iron cutlass, the black umbrella, and the black carriage. It really looked like a world of night. The black carriage drove through the straight and spacious official road, past the tombs of Yensei and Wei Guangming, past the dry reeds that looked like wheat seedlings in spring, and came to the green meadow. Behind the green meadow was a towering mountain. In front of the mountain was a unique and elegant building. In front of the building was a newly repaired stone archway, from which came the sound of reading. "Do you want to go back to the academy?" Ning Kai looked at the familiar house and asked Sang Sang. Sang Sang didn't say anything and just shook her head. Suddenly, the sound of studying in the classroom of the academy stopped for some reason. Then, two extremely clear and distant sounds of flute and zither played harmoniously, as if they were welcoming a distinguished guest. Ning Kai walked out of the carriage and saw senior brothers Shimin and Beigong, who were holding zither and flutes, seventh sister and the remaining senior brothers, Professor Huang He, and the female mathematics professor who was still wearing a blue gown today. Somehow he felt his eyes moisten. Sang Sang sat in the carriage, quietly listening to the sounds of the zither and the flute. After a long time, she finally lifted the green curtain in front of the carriage and came to the meadow among the flowers and trees. Many students of the academy ran out and looked curiously and confusedly at the black carriage on the meadow, wondering who it was. It actually alarmed the entire academy. These ordinary students in the front yard were newly recruited this year. Ning Kai didn't know any of them and no one knew him. He said to fourth brother, "I hope they can live longer." In the war against the Tang Empire 2 years ago, all the students of the academy, whether they were in the army or serving as officials in the harsh border commandery, suffered heavy casualties. He took Sang Sang to walk in the human world and endured endless pain and torture without giving up. Naturally, he didn't want such a thing to happen again. Fourth brother looked at him and said, "That depends on you, youngest brother." Ning Kai said, "Please rest assured, senior brother. I will try my best." Fourth brother nodded with relief and then turned to look at Sang Sang among the flowers and trees. He bowed deeply to the ground, and the disciples and instructors of the academy at the back of the mountain of the academy also bowed deeply to him. Although they were hostile to Haotian Taoism, most of the Tangs were believers of Haotian. Therefore, no matter where Sang Sang went, as long as they knew her identity, they would definitely bow to her and wish they could be as low as the dust. After all, the academy was the academy. It was natural for them to bow to Haotian, but they wouldn't kneel because they used to live with her and because Haotian was their enemy. When they bowed, they naturally couldn't play the zither or flute. The music had already stopped. Shimin Weiyang held the zither in his arms. When he straightened up, his eyes were already red. He stared at Sang Sang among the flowers and finally shed tears. He said, "Why are you still alive?" Sang Sang was still expressionless. She said, "I will never die." At this time, seventh sister had already spread the flower cloth on the meadow and was putting the prepared food on the cloth. Hearing this, she hurriedly said, "Let's eat first. They have to continue their journey." Just like in the shabby alley of Linkong City in the South Jin Kingdom, people who had lived in the academy would always think that eating was more important than anything, even if it was Haotian. Interestingly, Sang Sang still seemed to have the habit of living in the back of the mountain of the academy. Although she didn't say anything, she accepted Mu Yu's words and sat down beside the flower cloth. Shimin Weiyang wiped away the tears on his face and sat by her side. Picking up a pair of chopsticks, he placed all of the vinegar-soaked cabbage heads into his own bowl. Then he continuously sent them into his mouth. Only when his cheeks were bulging did he remember that he should chew them a bit. He chewed hard, and the cabbage heads and vinegar made a crunching sound between his teeth. It was unknown whether it was too sour or something else, but he frowned and seemed to be in pain. Sang Sang was a little unhappy, which made Shimin Weiyang happy. He didn't care whether you were Haotian or not. As long as you thought about it, you would turn into ashes. Anyway, you wouldn't be able to eat happily today. The farewell meal was not the last meal, so there was no need to eat miserably. However, it was impossible to eat happily in such a situation. If it weren't for the fear that they would never see Ning Kai again, people in the back of the mountain of the academy wouldn't have invited Sang Sang to dinner. It was quite possible that they would treat her to a few cuts. The picnic among the grass and flowers soon ended. Sang Sang returned to the horse carriage, and the onlookers gradually dispersed. Ning Kai finished talking with his senior brothers and sisters and was about to leave. However, seventh sister Mu Yu pulled him aside and whispered something to him. Ning Kai couldn't help but frown when he heard what she said. "Which direction are we going?" He asked Sang Sang when he entered the carriage. Sang Sang said, "To the west." After a moment of silence, Ning Ke asked, "Why does everyone have to go to the west?" Sang Sang said, "Has Junimo gone there?" Ning Ke said, "Second brother is going to cultivate Buddhism. Why are you going to Shenkong Temple?" Sang Sang didn't explain. Ning Ke thought of the lament he felt when he looked at Chang'an City from afar. He vaguely felt that everything was destined. How could there be a perfect law in the world? Could it be Buddhism? The iron wheel rolled on the stone path among the meadows silently. The black horse carriage went to the west as if it wanted to go back in time. Just as Ning Ke and Sang Sang set off, someone had already arrived in the west. In the extreme west of the wilderness, there was a boundless cliff. The cliff led to the bottom of the earth. It was extremely steep, spanning many miles. In the middle of the cliff was an extremely deep sinkhole, and at the bottom of the sinkhole was an extremely vast field. In the middle of the field was an extremely majestic mountain. If this mountain was on the ground, it might be higher than Tianqi Peak. However, because it was located in the sinkhole, one could only see the verdant peak from the ground. There were countless ancient trees on the giant peak, giving it a dense green. Hidden among the trees were countless yellow temples and Buddhist halls. These temples and Buddhist halls together formed the unknown place of Buddhism, Shenkong Temple. The drunkard stood on the edge of the cliff and looked at the giant peak in the distance. He looked at the peak that was parallel to his line of sight. After a long silence, the expression on his face gradually became cold. In terms of cultivation time, the Buddha was later than the drunkard and the butcher. However, in terms of the foundation he established in the human world and the state he reached, the Buddha was far better than the drunkard. As the Abbé Dean said, the drunkard and the butcher cultivated their desires, and they had cultivated to the extreme of human beings. But the Buddha cultivated himself, and when he reached nirvana, he had already surpassed human beings. When the Buddha was still preaching, the drunkard had never been to Shenkong Temple. After the Buddha reached nirvana, he had visited twice, but he had never entered, just like he had never entered the divine halls of West Hill. He had always felt a little uneasy. Looking at the yellow temples and halls among the peaks, the uneasiness in his heart became heavier and heavier. He vaguely felt that the Abbé Dean's thought had revealed an unimaginable truth. A clear and distant bell suddenly rang in a temple among the giant peaks. The bell rang through the forest and swept over the eaves. It took a long time for the bell to reach the wilderness beside the giant sinkhole and into his ears. There were two roads from Chang'an to the western wilderness. One was to go straight west, cross the Pamir Mountains, enter the Ueluan Mountains, and then go straight up to the western wilderness. The other one was to go north to the wilderness and then go straight west. Sang Sang said to go west but did not say how. So Ning Ke chose to go north first because there were many familiar sceneries and things along the way. He thought she would be touched. They went all the way north. The black horse carriage passed through Hebei County and went straight to Min Mountain. They passed by the road where he found her, and the forest where the old hunter used to live, but her expression did not change at all. Ning Ke was not disappointed. He believed that one day Sang Sang would be touched by the memories, and her humanity would triumph over divinity, and she would become a real human being. At that time he would be able to sing with her. Of course they would not sing Black Pig but the poem that was used to kill people. Ning Ke kept this optimistic thought or hope, until the horse carriage passed through the northern mountain road and came to the familiar earthen city. Then he realized that everything had changed. Please allow me to wish Miss Dobe a happy wedding, and today. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.